I'm learning to tell better stories. I'm learning how to manage
Welcome back, everyone. If you are just joining us now, this is day one of a 5-day course, The Fundamentals of Digital Photography, with this guy, John Gringo, my good friend. John, this is so much fun, again, to be hosting your class. My name is Kenna, and I'm hosting with my buddy Susan Roderick over there. Just wanted to talk a little bit about, if people didn't join us in the beginning of the class, that we have a quote contest going on. This man is pretty quotable, I would say. One of my favorite quotes so far is, there's a slide for that.
That's right. We're going to hear a lot more of that.
We will. Although we're going to try to keep our questions on topic to what you're talking about. But what we're going to be giving away is $149 every day. So essentially a free Creative Live class of your choosing. There are many, many John Gringo classes to find. If you're in the chat rooms right now, ask Susan or Nikki to drop in the link to John's page, his instructor page, where you can see, scroll down and see all of the different classes. But I thought it was cool, Susan and I were chatting, thought it was really cool that you said that you watch a lot of Creative Live classes as well.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's a very efficient way to learn for me. I mean, I don't have time to go visit the class, and I'm taking right now 2 Creative Live classes. But
what are they?
I am taking Laura Shu's Lightroom class, and then Jared Platt's Lightroom class. I mean, I teach Lightroom, and I'm always looking to kind of increase my knowledge as well. So even though I teach it, I'm still learning it.
I think that's really cool. And in fact, we've had some comments in the classroom. I think Flora MC, who's a regular, who also teaches. And so we've seen a number of people say, you're teaching the teachers, and they love it. So we've talked about cameras in the last section, went through, my goodness, all the different types that are available to everyone. What are we going to do again in this section?
Well, we need to catch up. We didn't completely get all the camera systems in.
Okay.
We are actually going to be talking about the shutter system and then very quickly moving into shutter speeds.
Great. All right, well, let's do that.
Good.
Over to you, John.
All righty. Okay, so one of the other ways that we can describe how a camera works is by the shutter system in the camera. And there are 2 different systems that are available today. On some of the point-and-shoots, well, actually, I should say probably pretty much all the point-and-shoots, and some of the medium format cameras that we're not going to be getting too much into, and the older and still around large format cameras, they use what's called a leaf shutter system because the shutters look very much like a little leaf system. It's a very simple, small, and lightweight system that opens and closes, and it is all right within the lens. So it's very small and a compact system. So the advantages of the system is it's very simple, which is why they put it in point-and-shoot cameras. It's very quiet. These cameras have just a very, very slight little click when you fire the shutter. And one of the nice things is that you can fire a flash at any shutter speed available. And it's a great system for studio photographers, and that's why it's on some of those medium format cameras. The disadvantage on these systems is that you can't set really high shutter speeds, like 1/8,000th of a second. Just due to the nature of the way it opens up and closes, it doesn't work well at high speeds. You have to buy a unique one that goes in every lens. It comes with the lens. You don't need to install it. But every lens you buy, you have to have its own shutter system built into it. So it's going to complicate the lens design. And so it limits what they can do with the lens itself. And so you're going to find that is in very, very few cameras. It's mainly just the point and shoots. The little Fuji that I showed you earlier, it's in pretty much all those point and shoots. But it is an option on some other larger cameras. Now, the focal plane shutter is what's being used in all of our SLRs, in pretty much all of our mirrorless cameras as well. And so, not too concerned about the viewing system right here, but when the light comes into the image sensor, before it hits the image sensor, it's blocked by the shutter, okay? And we used to call it the shutter curtain because it was made out of cloth, but in reality, nowadays, it's made out of very lightweight metals, but we still call it the shutter curtain in many cases. There is two curtains in each camera. There is a first curtain and a second curtain. And so when you take the exposure, what's going to happen is the first curtain will drop away. That's your exposure, whatever shutter speed you have chosen. And then the second curtain will come down and block the light off. Now, the reason that there are two curtains rather than one just closing again is so that each pixel is exposed for exactly the same amount of time. So that's the focal plane shutter, and it's obviously called that because it's right where the sensor is. It's directly in front of the sensor. Now, in this illustration, you can see how it kind of scans in the light. And so this is the way that the trailing curtain will follow the first curtain. And although the image isn't being exposed at exactly the same time, every pixel will get the exact same amount of light. And I worked really hard on this illustration, so I'm going to show it to you twice, honestly. And so this is what happens at very high shutter speeds, like 1/4000th of a second. So that's the focal plane shutter system, so we can have these really high-speed shutters, and you can have as long a shutter as you would ever like. So let's talk about some of the advantages of your standard Nikon, Canons, and most of your mirrorless systems. It's a proven technology. We know how to work these very, very quickly. We have the very fast shutter speed, so pretty much every camera available today is going to have a 4,000th of a second or faster as its top shutter speed. And it simplifies the lens construction because we don't need to worry about anything in the lens. It's all done in the camera body. Now, the disadvantage of this is that we have limited sync speeds. So, for instance, as I was showing you the scanning, you can't fire a flash because it's only going to illuminate part of the subject. And so you have a limitation on how fast you can shoot while firing the flash. There is a little bit of vibration. And I know there are some macro photographers out there that have really intense magnification, and any movement, just that little shutter movement right there, will cause a blur in the picture. And there's a way around it on some cameras, which is kind of interesting. So it does cause a little bit of vibration. And there is a limitation if you wanted to fire a camera at, say, something ridiculous like 100 frames a second. Just think about having all those curtains go up and down 100 frames a second. There's going to be a limitation. And so right now, there are cameras out there from Nikon and Canon that will shoot 10, 12, 14 frames a second. But they're just right at the edge of what those types of shutter units can handle. Now, if we go back to the mirrorless camera, you recall that we have a little bit different system inside. We don't have the mirror box housing. The light comes straight back to the image sensor, and that's what you're seeing in the viewfinder. Now let's take a little closer look at what's going on right at the sensor itself. So light's coming into the sensor. Now you guys remember picking up the cameras, and you could see right through them, right? That means that light has to be getting to the sensor. You can't have the shutter in front of it. So now, most people don't know this about mirrorless cameras. When you take a picture, here's what happens. It closes the shutter, and then for the exposure, it opens it. This is the picture. And then it closes it because it has to stop the exposure. And then it has to open it again so that you can see through the camera again. So the camera is essentially working double duty because it's an electronic viewfinder and it needs to see light through that all at the same time. So the shutter unit is working very hard, you might say, in the mirrorless cameras. Now, some mirrorless cameras have an option for an electronic shutter. And this is going to change the way cameras are made and the way we work with cameras. So what happens in some cameras, and this varies quite a bit now because this technology is evolving very, very quickly, is that the camera will, like flipping a switch, will just suddenly start recording. No closing and opening of a shutter curtain, but it does need the second curtain to cut off the amount of light. It's very hard to turn a sensor on and off when it's accepting light the entire time. And so it's a little bit of a technology hurdle that they're having some problems getting over with right now. But there are some cameras that are full electronic shutters, which means there's no physical moving part. And what happens is the camera just flips a switch, it starts recording, and then it flips the switch and turns it off. Visually not very exciting, okay? I have a hard time illustrating how something just magically turns on and off. But what is kind of interesting about this is that when we get rid of the shutter movement, we get rid of the shutter sound. That familiar traditional click. No more. And so there's a couple of cameras over here. The Panasonic GX7 can shoot silently. So if you, say, had to go into a courtroom or an opera house and you had to shoot pictures and you had very strict restrictions on how loud you could shoot, you would want to look for a camera with an electronic shutter. There are very, very few. And when using that camera, I don't like using the silent shutter, the electronic shutter, because I kind of need that satisfying click. And so I will actually turn on a little beep sound, very subtle and quiet so that it can be quiet, just to get that feedback that, yes, did the camera actually fire a picture? But I imagine that we're going to have more electronic shutters in the future, and we're going to have to start asking ourselves, how much noise do we want our cameras to make? I heard that the Toyota Prius was too quiet of a car, and in future models, they're going to force them to make more engine noise so that as a person walking down the street, you're going to be able to hear the car. And so we might, I don't know if we're going to pass a law to make cameras make more noise, but that's something that's going to be going on in these cameras. So that's the electronic shutter. The advantage is zero vibrations. So those macro photographers that don't want any vibrations, look for a camera that has an electronic option for firing that shutter, at least at the beginning. Potential for extremely rapid shot speeds. This little Panasonic shoots at 40 frames a second, which is amazing. And it's silent, as we've been talking about. Now, the disadvantage with this electronic system is that there is a limitation with really high speeds right now. This is a bit of technology that will get better, but you can't fire at really high shutter speeds like 0.008 of a second. It's a new technology, and there are occasional image quality issues at these higher shutter speeds. And they do warn you in the instruction manual. I haven't got a good visual test of it yet, but I'll be looking at that for some of my new classes. And that no satisfying click. Gotta like the click. And that's one of the criticisms of certain cameras, is it doesn't make a good click sound. All right, so that is the shutter system in the camera, which is, not hugely important for many people in the buying of the camera, but is something to know about. So let me check back in with Ken and Susan to see, are there any questions regarding the shutter system in the camera?
There don't seem to be any specifically about the shutter. Let's see. People are just commenting about what they know about the shutters and everything like that. So I think we're
good.
Yeah. We're good. Unless
Okay.
you guys have any questions, does anyone? We're good with the shutter. So let's keep
Oh,
rolling.
wait.
I got a little question.
Yes.
Always a question.
What happens when you're, like I have this Canon 60D and you can use live view mode and
Right.
that opens it up so
Right.
that you can see what's happening. But then when you do take the picture, it's kind of slower. It doesn't really come out the right way.
Right. So
What's
on an
happening?
SLR, when you put it in live view, the mirror comes up, and your camera becomes a mirrorless camera in that regard. So what happens is the shutter closes, and then it opens. That's the exposure. Then it closes, and then it opens again. And that's why it's slower. It's because it has to go through that closing phase and then reopening phase at the end. Good question.
Great. Well, that question just came up in the chat room, so you are a representative of
I love it.
people
I love
on
it when, again, we see the same questions coming. So that's great. Let's keep going.
All right. We're going to talk about shutter speeds now. All right. We've talked about how they get there, but now it's time for talking about shutter speeds. Okay, quick quiz for people in the classroom. It's going to be a little hard for people at home to keep up, but take the quiz as well. We've got two numbers on screen. which number is larger? All right? All right. Now, instantly, most people are going to go, oh, yeah, this one here. Not a single student pulled out their phone to kind of pull up the number app to see which number was larger. It's just something you instinctively know, and that's going to be a problem. And here's why. Most of the times when we talk about shutter speeds, we're going to be talking about fractions of a second. All right? So 1/2 of a second is a longer period of time than 1/8 of a second. All right? And so this is something that they don't often show you in the cameras. You're just going to see the number 2 and the number 8, and you got to remember that's 1/2 of a second and 1/8 of a second. So just keep that in mind as we go through our shutter speeds. So here is the full list of shutter speeds that is available in most cameras today. All right? Range from 1/8,000th of a second down to 30 seconds. Let's start at the simplest shutter speed possible, 1 second. So we all know what 1 second is. And you'll notice that the 1 second is indicated by the little quotation mark. So that's the indication, and it will be like that in your cameras as well. They'll have 1 and then a little quotation beside it. When we go to 2 seconds, we have obviously doubled the amount of time. And in this case, we double the amount of light. It's a straight 1-to-1 ratio. You double the time, you double the light. And in photography, we'll often use a term called a stop of light. And it means that we've either doubled it or we've cut it in half. So it's just very simply doubling and cutting in half. You'll say, you need to stop more light, or you need to stop less light, or you should open up a stop or close down a stop. And it is kind of referring to the f-stop. Well, it is referring to the f-stop, but we have kind of carried it over to work with shutter speeds as well, anytime we want more or less light. And then your camera will have many, many slower shutter speeds. And if it wanted to, you could go to infinity on shutter speeds. You know, there is no limit on longer shutter speeds. It's just as long as you want. So when we go from 1 second to a 1/2 second, we have half as much light because we have half as much time. This is a very awkward shutter speed to find in cameras because some cameras will list it as 2. 1/2 is a half. Some cameras will go with the decimal system as in 0.5, but they don't have a point, so they use the little quotation. So 0 quotation 5 is 0.5 or a half of a second. And so same thing, just different ways of describing it in numbers. A normal shutter speed up around a 60th of a second, and then cameras will go up to 1/8,000th of a second. And I'm going to throw a challenge to the folks at home, and you guys can monitor these. What SLR camera, single lens reflex, had the fastest shutter speed, and what shutter speed was it? There was one particular camera that stood out at some point in time that went above 1/8,000th of a second. What camera was that? What brand and what model? And what shutter speed did it go to? And I will check in at some later point and we get on that. Okay. So between these full stop shutter speeds, you might say, there are third stops so that you can be very, very precise about setting. So between a 30th and a 15th, we have a 25th and a 20th of a second. And we call these third stops, and it just allows us to be very, very exact. It does clutter up the screen a lot, so I'm not going to use it a lot in the class here, and we're going to kind of stay with the whole numbers in here. Now, something you might also find if you go beyond 30 seconds is something called bulb. If you have a Nikon camera, if you go past 30, you'll often find bulb, depending on the camera. With Canon cameras, sometimes you will, sometimes you won't. Sometimes up on the mode dial on the top of the camera, there'll be a B setting. B stands for bulb. And what bulb refers to is a old bulb cable release. And in the old days, we had a little shutter that was fired by a cable and an air bulb. We squeezed the air bulb, and it would push the cable and it would open the shutter. And as long as we were squeezing down on the bulb, the shutter would stay open. So if you would like to leave your shutter open for longer than 30 seconds, 31, 32, 3 hours, 3 days, you would need a cable release that you could lock open. And so that's what the bulb timer is for. Now, from a guy who does like to do nighttime photography, I really don't go much beyond 30 seconds most of the time. It's pretty rare that I would ever go. I've done it a few times. The longest I think I have is maybe 5 minutes. I have a viewer that said he took a picture and he showed me a 17-minute exposure. That's kind of the limitation on the sensors, is a few minutes. They heat up and they have a noise problem. So you typically are not going to go too long with that. All right. Now, why are we going to choose one shutter speed over the other? What's our motivation and reasoning for doing this? Well, first off, there's a technical reason. We need to let in less light. We're going to choose a faster shutter speed. Or we need to let in more light, and we're going to let in a longer shutter speed. And the other reason is aesthetics. If we want to freeze the motion, we're going to use a faster shutter speed. And if we want to blur the motion, we're going to take a slower speed. So let me ask students in the class. Somebody's got to volunteer for an answer here. When does shutter speed not matter? When do you not care about shutter speed? Who knows? Is there a situation you'd be taking a picture and you're like, I really don't care what shutter speed I choose? Nothing? I'm glad you're in this class then. What if you were taking a picture of a statue that wasn't moving? Do you need a fast shutter speed to stop a statue's movement? No. So if something is not moving, you can use any shutter speed you want if that's kind of your first choice. So you're going to have to get very, very smart with subjects that move, which is what we're going to be doing right now. Photographers are acutely aware of time and motion. And you're probably saying, I know about time. I know the difference between a day and a month. That's no big deal. Well, we're going to be just going to a smaller scale. The difference between a thousandth of a second and a 500th of a second is fairly important to some photographers. And you're going to have to really be a good judge of motion. All right? Human eye is very sensitive to motion, but you're going to have to get really analytical on the type of motion that you're seeing. And the way I like to do this is I want to go through all the shutter speeds. So we're going to start at the fastest shutter speed, 1/8,000th of a second. And when I first started putting this class together, I go, well, I need to show what an 8,000th of a second looked like. And I had 0 pictures that represented 8,000th of a second. So I had to go out and create a photograph of a water droplet falling into my water bottle. And that's what it's going to do. It's going to stop something moving very, very fast in action. Now, I went to an air show, and you could use an 8,000th of a second if you wanted to freeze the propeller, and I could still see just a smidgen of blur. And aviation photographers probably are not going to like this photograph. Aviation photographers often want to have a little bit of blur to let you know that the propeller is actually moving and the plane is not falling out of the sky. It doesn't look normal that it would be frozen like that. And so you have to be thinking about what you want in your final image. Okay, many cameras, their top shutter speed is 4,000th of a second. And that's going to do a pretty good job at stopping this hummingbird. Now, in class, you're going to be quizzed here. Take a good look at this photograph and think about that wings being frozen. And the next photograph, which is also at 4,000th of a second, but now the wings are a little blurry. The question is, why are the wings blurry here? And if I go back, why are they sharp here? They're sharp here. They're blurry here. We did not change the shutter speed. Can anyone judge? Melissa?
Your depth of field?
Depth of field is incorrect.
Okay.
I was moving is incorrect. I don't move. Anybody else have an idea? Let me go back to the first one.
It was just that fast that you caught the hummingbird when its wing was. You actually stopped the action there, and in the next shot it came up. The wing came up. You actually caught the motion, stopped the motion.
Yes.
But there was no motion in the wing on the first shot you took.
Yes, but why?
I'm thinking it's the bird. You caught exactly what was there because you had such a fast shutter speed.
You're so close, I think we should give her half credit. Okay.
Is it about what else is said on the camera?
It's nothing to do with the camera. It has nothing to do with the camera.
Okay.
Think about the motion. A hummingbird's wings that comes back, and it kind of stops for a second, and then they start moving forward. And so peak speed is much faster here than it was in the previous shot. It's not a consistent movement. Now, for the bird photographers, I apologize. I'm simplifying the hummingbird's motion. It's a bit of a movement, but it's slower back here than it is here. And so you have to be a very critical judge of how fast is that wing moving at that given of a second. Does that make sense now? Okay? Good, because we're going to kind of come back to that idea as we go along. Okay. 0.02 of a second has frozen the motion of this bird's wings. Can somebody in the class tell me why this bird's wings are frozen and the hummingbird's was blurry?
His wings are so much slower.
The wings are so much bigger. Bigger birds move more slowly. So now you're starting to judge exactly how fast that movement is. Very good. Okay. 2,000, how about a dog in flight? Yeah, 0.02 of a second is going to capture the dog in flight. But what I kind of like is it's frozen the water droplets in the air around the dog, in which you got to get pretty fast shutter speeds to freeze water movement in the air. How about a penguin in flight? Did you know penguins can fly? Yes, but not very far. Okay, and so something jumping, moving around very quickly is where we're going to be using these extremely fast shutter speeds. I shoot a lot of cross-country. I'm a cross-country coach, so I warn you right now I'm going to have a lot of running photos in today's, and actually the entire presentation to some degree. And so 0.1000 of a second, we've got nice sharp face, the feet, the legs, the arms, nice sharp picture here. A couple of key shutter speeds I will take special note of. First is 0.05 of a second. 0.05 is going to be a good shutter speed for freezing human action. Sports, dance, anything that humans are involved in. Generally, the lowest shutter speed that you would want to go to is a 0.05 of a second. So a question for my in-studio class. If I had chosen a faster shutter speed, would they be more frozen? Can you be more frozen? If you take an ice cube out of one freezer and put it in another, even colder freezer, does it become more frozen? No. And this is a very important theory to have. When you're trying to stop motion, the goal is to get a shutter speed fast enough to stop the action. And sometimes I like to go one extra for safety. But you don't need to go crazy. Okay? And when I say go crazy, you don't need 0.008 of a second. Okay? And what happens is that you're let in very little light, and you're going to have to make up for it with the ISO and the aperture. It's going to make things very difficult there. So for sports photographers, you want to choose the minimum to do the job, maybe one extra just for safety. And that's all you need to do. All right. Now, 0.05 of a second. The last one, they were frozen. This one, they're blurry. What? Why is this one blurry? In the last picture of those people dancing, why is it frozen? 0.05 of a second, same shutter speed. Because the bird moves faster than the humans do. All right? And so that's why we're going to get blurriness there. 2/50 of a second. This is where we're going to start. I said 0.05 was stopping for human, was good for stopping human motion. I will learn to speak. And here we're starting to get a little bit of blurriness. Here in the feet and over here in these wood mallets, we're starting to get a little bit of blurriness. And this is why I don't shoot runners with 2/50 of a second. It's because when you start looking at them really closely, you zoom in and you look at the sharpness, you're like, ooh, that's not really sharp. It's just a little bit fuzzy. And I'm thinking, well, maybe the lens wasn't sharp, or I didn't focus quite right. Well, if you look at the shoe, which is not moving in this case, that one looks pretty sharp. And what's happening is the runner's upper body and head is moving a little bit, and that's visible at 2/50 of a second. And this is why sports photographers just generally don't shoot at 2/50 of a second, because athletes in a wide variety of sports are moving faster than that. They need a faster shutter speed. Still at 2/50, but he's nice and sharp because he's not moving as fast as the girl in the last photo. And here we're starting to get a little bit of mix. You notice the little bit of blurriness in the stick here and a little bit of blurriness in the tire. And we got this little puff of dust right here that's in the air. That gets to be kind of fun in a photograph when you have this mix of sharpness and blurriness in the right areas. And so there can be some really interesting shutter speeds in this range. Now, if I kind of had to draw a line and just say what's a faster shutter speed and what's not, I would probably draw it around 2/50 of a second. And so here at 125th of a second, it's going to stop the motion of the camel's legs walking in the desert. 125th of a second is about as bad a shutter speed as you can choose for shooting runners and sports in action. It's just not the right shutter speed. And it's not that it's too slow, it's just the wrong shutter speed. We're getting this subtle blurriness, and in general, now you can choose this to be your own style, but most people don't like a little bit of blurriness in their photograph. Either do something very specifically blurry with it or make it very sharp, one or the other. Those halfway measures don't work well. 60th of a second is another key shutter speed that I think is important because it's good for stopping casual human motion. And so if somebody's just standing there, not moving around that much, like me right now, I'm not moving around a lot, a 60th of a second would be acceptable for stopping that type of motion. And so we got a lot of people moving around, and they don't seem like massive blurs because the 60th did a good job with that. These monks are doing kind of a slow dance move. They're not jumping around real quick. They're moving around. And if you look critically close, there is a little bit of blurriness in there, but very, very little at a 60th of a second. And very quickly, we're going to draw another line, and now we're getting into slower shutter speeds. So we've gone very quickly from fast to normal to slow shutter speeds. So at a 30th of a second, we're going to start getting blurriness the more movement we have in the photograph. And these can be fun shots. Now, this shot also is a good example of panning. So I'm taking the camera and I'm following the subject so that the subject is as sharp as possible, but the background is as blurry as possible. And in general, when you are shooting action and sports, you're almost always panning and following the subject. Very rarely do you just set the camera up here and wait for somebody to come in front. That's just not the way it's normally done for most types of photography. Down to a 15th of a second. This is one of my favorite shutter speeds because you get this real mix of blurriness and sharpness. And once again, another panning shot, keeping something as in the middle of the frame or as consistent position in the frame as possible. And I don't know that there's anything in focus in this photograph, but I like it for the mix-up of color. And so blurry shots can be good if they are done correctly. And so here is the way sports photographers generally don't work, is set the camera up on a tripod and wait for something to happen in front of it. And so that's how much blurriness you're going to get with some marathon runners at a 15th of a second. I was attacked by a shark. It was a traumatic experience out here on Lake Washington, which many of you know is a freshwater lake. Now, it might have been a buoy, but one of the key things that I did is I took a picture, and I set my camera to 1/15th of a second. And if you ever get attacked by a shark, I would highly recommend setting 1/15th of a second because it'll make it seem more exciting. Down at 1/8 of a second, I guess it's the second picture now, but this picture was taken on a tripod. All right? Now, you'll notice that the flowers in the foreground are blurry. Notice that? See that? And the flowers in the background appear to be pretty sharp. So my question to you guys is, why are these flowers blurry and these ones not? Because we're outside, there's probably a wind blowing all the flowers at the same amount. Why are these blurry and why are these not? Can anybody figure that one out? What do you got, Melissa?
My guess would be that because you're closer to them, you can see them moving more.
That's right. Very good. These take up much more space, many more pixels, than the smaller ones in the background. So not only is speed important, but proximity is important. And so if you think about moving your hand in front of your face, there's a lot of movement. But when somebody way over here is moving, it's just a little bit of movement. So how close is something moving to the front of the camera?
John,
yes.
Did you take that photo of the tulips the day that we went to the Tulip Festival?
I did not.
No, a different time.
I'm sorry, it was a different day. I have gone up there multiple times.
You went without Ken and I?
Once. Sorry. We'll make a date and go this year.
Right. Last year we got the chance to go with John, and it was really cool testing out. We got to use his tilt shift lenses and all kinds of things. So being in the field with John is pretty cool.
In the field of flowers.
Nice. No pun intended.
Okay, so at 1/8 of a second, we're getting to the very limits of how slow a shutter speed I can pan with. And I'm getting a lot of blurriness in here. And the fact of the matter is I took a lot of pictures that I had to throw away because they were just way too blurry. But this is kind of a fun shot that kind of mixes up a little bit of sharpness with a little bit of blurriness. Now we're going to lock the camera off on a tripod again. You can see the bridge is nice and sharp. We've got some people walking in front, and that's how much blurriness you can expect at 1/15th of a second. Or excuse me, that was 1/8 of a second. Getting down at 1/4 of a second, you can shoot fireworks at a lot of different shutter speeds. 1/4 is not a bad place to get started. I've shot fireworks anywhere from 1 second up to a 60th of a second. It kind of depends on the ambient light and a number of other factors, but that might be a good starting point if that's what you're interested in doing. As we get down to these very slow shutter speeds, you just need to start looking at the world around you and things that move and start trying to conjure up ideas as to what that's going to look like at different shutter speeds, because you get some very interesting effects. Now, this isn't to say that every slow shutter speed shot you take is going to be a very blurry shot. If your subject is not moving, if your camera is not moving, you can get extraordinarily sharp pictures. And so it's just a matter of making sure those things are as steady and as still as possible. Once again, you're not going to get an even amount of blurriness. It depends on how close the penguins are to you and how much they happen to be moving in that one fraction of a second you chose to take the picture. All right, so this one is kind of an interesting one. So we got this train coming through, and the cars down here are very, very blurry. But if we look up around the curve up here, they're much sharper. And there's actually two reasons for that. Can anybody here tell me one or both reasons why the cars are sharper here and more blurry here? These are concepts we've talked about. At least one of the ideas is something we've talked about. One is not.
Have you focused further out?
Nope.
Oh.
The whole scene is set for everything in focus.
Okay.
Anybody else? We've talked about this idea. Think how close the train is to us here. How much of the frame it fills up versus the little tiny cars back here. Okay, so proximity reasons, this one's blurry. But kind of the main reason this is blurry is because it's moving across more pixels. As this subject is moving towards us, the train's all moving at the same speed, but the apparent motion isn't that much. Have you ever been on a highway and you look at a car coming towards you, it's doing 60 miles an hour, but it doesn't look like it's moving. It looks like it's almost just sitting there. You can't tell if they're driving or not until you get right up next to it. And so the direction of movement is important. The proximity of movement is also important. 1 full second. That's a good place to get started if you like those blurry waterfall river type shots. So you need to get that shutter speed pretty long to get that kind of mystical look to it, which is a lot of fun. 1 second. Can you stand still for 1 second? Pretty hard. You're often going to get a little bit of blurriness with people just standing there even. Moving down to 2 seconds. More waterfalls, lots of water. We're going to see a lot more water as we get to these slower shutter speeds. If you're a landscape photographer and you like to photograph around sunrises and sunsets, you're often going to be out there after the sun's gone down, and there's still this beautiful blue in the sky, one of my favorite times of the day to shoot. And you're going to have your tripod out, and you're going to have your camera's shutter open for 4 seconds, just absorbing light for 4 seconds. All right, 4 seconds. Notice once again, we have blurriness in the people down here, less blurry up here. Can you tell me why? Why are they're all walking in about the same speed? Why is that?
Because they're closer.
They're closer, and
the direction.
And the direction, kind of the angle of view. You're looking straight down on the top. They're moving just as far, just not apparently because of the angle of view. So you have to be thinking about both of those factors. 8 full seconds. I got to admit, I did a little cheesy trick on this one. I zoomed the lens as the picture was being taken. You're not supposed to touch the camera when it's on the tripod, but I wanted to get these lights flaring out. And so what I did is I just set up the camera on a tripod, 8 seconds, and about halfway in, I just zoomed the camera in to a closer shot. And that's how I ended up getting those lights coming off the side. I like to do a little bit of architectural type photography. Here's our library in Seattle with an 8-second exposure. You'll notice a lot of blurriness in the flags. The wind was blowing. And it was just the right shutter speed to get the correct balance of light between the setting blue in the sky and the ambient light of all the street lights and building lights. So we're getting into some pretty long shutter speeds now, 15 seconds. This is where we start getting into kind of like full-on nighttime photography. So this is Monument Valley. Wanted to get a picture of the mittens lit up by the moon, but also a little bit of the stars as well in there. 15 seconds down on South Georgia Island. We'll see a lot of penguin shots too. And we get a fair bit of movement in the penguins, although some of them are standing pretty steady for 15 seconds. And down at 30 seconds, which is the longest shutter speed on most cameras. This is down on the Oregon coast. I'm just leaving the shutter open. This is not fog, it's not mist, it's just water rolling in and out on the ocean's edge. And then down from Death Valley, I did a self-timer shot. And this, I was trying to get some pictures of these rocks that move across the desert floor. I'll talk more about those later. And I wanted to get the stars out there. And I was just trying to kill time, goof around, and when you get bored, you just start doing weird stuff. So I took my headlamp out and I started spinning it around. It's called light painting. And it's a whole great little niche of photography. And you can either use the light source as your subject matter, or you can light up other objects out there. So that was a lot of fun. I think we should do it again. And so what we're going to do now, oh wait, I got more stuff. That's right, I have new stuff. This is the micro improvements. Here's a picture taken at 4 minutes. And so this was under conditions that it was so dark, I had to take a 4-minute exposure, look at the picture, readjust the focus so that I could take another 4-minute exposure because I couldn't see what was going on with my own eyes. I wanted to throw in, what does it look like at even longer? So this is about as long as I would ever go digitally. But back in the days of film, I would go for 4 hours and I would get star trails. I was working on a whole project on Mount Rainier, and we carried all these cameras up and set them up to shoot for different periods of time. And so we have the North Star up here, and the Earth is rotating, which brings that movement around. You can see a little bit of a plane moving through the side over here. We did this again on another side of Mount Rainier, and we're shooting with a fairly wide-angle lens, and it's kind of an unusual effect that you don't often get, but you can see the curves going in opposite directions around the North Pole and the South Pole. And it's kind of funny because when I got the film back from the developer, I looked at it, and my first reaction was, oh no, there's a scratch. And what I was looking at was actually the lights of the climbers who are climbing Mount Rainier had illuminated the mountain for the entire time. You could see the path that they were heading up the mountain on because they were illuminating the snow with their headlamps that they all had on. And so you can do really long shots. This was done with film, and it's one of the things I missed most about shooting film is these really long exposures. All right, as I said, we're going to go back and we're going to do this again, but this time we're going to stay locked on one subject, a rock in the river. And so here's what it looks like at 2,000th of a second. We have something fast. We've frozen the motion. And as we go down to slower and slower shutter speeds, at a certain point, in this case, around 2/50th of a second, we're getting kind of this uneasy blurriness. Now, if you would like to know my definition of hell, it would be sitting in a dentist office looking at this photo. This would just drive me nuts if I had to look at this for 45 minutes. That slightly out of focus, I think somebody did something wrong here. It would just drive me nuts. And so with anything that moves, there's going to be these kind of in-between slow shutter speeds that just do not look right. Now, in this case, it starts looking a little bit more interesting at a 15th of a second. And so as we go to slower and slower shutter speeds, what's happening is the rock's definition is becoming more clear, and the blurriness is becoming more blurry, so we can see a greater difference between what is sharp and what is blurry. And that contrast, I think, plays out the best at 1 full second. And so this is a good experiment where you can go out, shoot at different shutter speeds, and look at what your pictures look like. And this is, without moving the camera, just playing around with shutter speeds, having some fun, and seeing what works. Did we have a question in class? Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to ask you, I think it was maybe one of the night scenes or maybe the ocean scene where you were down at about a 15th. I wondered if you had different lenses, or it really has nothing to do with anything but the shutter speed. Could you do that with all lenses, for instance?
Yes, you
like
could.
An 18 to 150
yeah,
or whatever?
Yeah, with any lens, whether it's wide angle, telephoto, almost no matter what aperture it is, you're going to be able to shoot nighttime stuff.
Okay.
Yeah, now these star shots, I've done a bit of the star shots, and I have found that to get good star shots, you can't have too long a shutter speed. You don't want to do a 4-minute exposure with stars because they'll move a noticeable amount. So either you want to do a 4-hour one, like the mountain shots I showed you, or you need to keep it around 30 seconds, 15 or 30 seconds. And if you shoot it at 15 or 30 seconds, you end up needing a lens that goes down to f2 in most cases. I've done it with 2.8 lenses, but this is, I almost went out and bought a lens just so that I could shoot nighttime shots. And I bought a 1.4 lens so that I could shoot nighttime shots more easily. And I had more versatility in shooting that. So the lens, it does matter to some degree, but any lens you have, you can shoot at any shutter speed. All right, so safe shutter speeds for hand holding the camera. I said there was a slide for it, and I'm really mad that you guys don't have cameras in your hand right now. Don't worry about it. We're not going to do it. Okay, so folks at home, pick up your camera right now, put it in your hands like you are ready to shoot a picture, okay? I want you to think about how you are holding the camera, all right? Now, there is a better technique and a worse technique, and I don't know how you're ever going to remember this, but you want the thumb up, that's good, and thumb down is bad, all right? Let me grab a camera over here. Which one shall I grab? Ooh. Okay, I'll grab the Fuji. All right, so a lot of people, when they grab a camera, they do this, okay? And the problem is the chicken wing flapping out in the wind, okay? It's not steady on anything. If you put it this way, which a lot of people don't feel comfortable with right away, but you'll get used to it, trust me, gets the arms closer into the body, and you're able to hold the camera much more steady. Rather than this, doing this. And also, if you get longer lenses, it allows you to, let's see, don't have anything. Well, this one will work. So if you have a lens like this that's a little bit bigger that has a nice focusing ring on it, I can support the camera in the base of this, and now I have really fine-tuned control because the fingers aren't supporting the weight of the camera. Whereas over here, I'm supporting the weight and trying to focus. In this case, I have a little bit better fine motor controls for controlling focusing and or zooming. And so that's a better system. Just practice it, you'll get used to it. It's a very, very simple system. Okay, so holding the camera. You have to be concerned about your movement as well as your subject's. And the old rule of thumb, which is you take the focal length of your lens, and I realize we haven't explained this, but I'm sure a lot of you already know what we're talking about. In this case, we have a 60 millimeter lens. And what we're going to do is use a minimum shutter speed of 1 over the focal length, which means what's our focal length? 60. 1 over 60 is 1/60th of a second. That is the slowest shutter speed that you should probably hold this lens for taking handheld pictures. And so let's take a look at a bunch of other lenses. So if you have a 70 to 200, well, it depends on where the lens is zoomed at for that particular shot. It could be around a 60th or to 250th. We do a bit of rounding in photography, so you don't have to get it exact, just get it close. Your standard 50 millimeter lens, like in this case Nikon has a 58 millimeter lens, where we're just going to round up and call that 1/60th of a second. For a wide angle lens, a 14 millimeter, well, you could hold that probably down to 1/15th of a second. Now this is a rule of thumb, which means it's not exact. It's generalized, okay? And this is going to depend on how much tremor that you have in your own movement. Question in class? Do you account for the crop factor? We do, and I have a slide for that. I'm keeping it simple right now. Right. And so, yes, we will factor that in. I'll explain that more to everyone else later. Okay. All right, so the other thing that's changed a lot in the last, well, not that last, but somewhat currently, is the new stabilization systems built into the lenses and or the cameras. And so Canon calls it image stabilized. Nikon has their own term, vibration reduction. Other companies will choose their own terms. And the idea here, for instance, if you have a 200 millimeter lens, and for whatever reason, you are locked into a 60th of a second. Don't worry about why, it just is. You're likely to get a blurry shot because you just can't hold a 200 millimeter lens steady at a 60th of a second. With a stabilization system of some sort, you're likely to get a pretty good sharp shot because the camera is going to be able to account for it. Now, a number of the lenses have ratings on how good they are at stabilization. And this is something that you got to dig a little for. It's not listed on the lens. It's not even in the specifications. You sometimes have to go back to where they introduced the lens and they told you how good it is. For instance, Nikon 16 to 35, Nikon claims, is good for 2.5 stops of VR, which means it's going to help you out by 2.5 stops. You want that number as big as possible. So the 300-2.8 is 3 stops, and their 18 to 55 will actually help you out 4 stops of light. And so with an 18 to 55 at 4 stops, We could be here, 1, 2, 3, 4. You could maybe go all the way down to a quarter of a second. With Canon lenses, a lot of them these days are rated at 4 stops. I've gone through, and most all of them are 4 stops. An older lens like the Canon 100 to 400, which is probably more than a decade old at this point, that's their older technology. They weren't as good at making stabilization in that regard. Now, if you do plan on using a tripod, you got to remember to turn off the stabilization. And it seems weird. I got stabilization and I got more stabilization. Why do I need to turn it off? And there's a number of problems. Basically, it's that the sensors sense movement of the lens and the motor, and it's trying to correct for its own movement. So it's getting caught in a feedback loop of trying to solve a problem that it's constantly causing. And so you want to flip it into the off mode whenever you're shooting from a tripod. And I have seen some camera manufacturers say that their cameras and or lenses understand when they're on a tripod and they shut down. It's still safest to turn it off, just to be sure. Now, I know a lot of newer photographers, they're getting excited about photography, and they're thinking, okay, I'm going to be a photographer, and I really don't want to shoot with a tripod. I'm not going to be that type of photographer, because that's like a whole nother area of photography. I'm not going to do that. That's fine. It's your choice. It's whatever you want to shoot. But if you think about it, that means you're going to limit yourself roughly to a 60th of a second or faster, and you can only shoot subjects that work with that shutter speed. You're totally eliminating a huge world of photography. And so photographs taken with a tripod obviously are for low light conditions mainly, but it's going to be used for many more reasons. And it's just going to open up all sorts of potentials for you. The reasons why tripods are so helpful is preventing blur. We like sharp photos. They're going to help out. We'll talk about this more in depth of field, but it's going to help you get lots of depth of field. It's going to enable really precise composition. I delete hardly any photos that I take from a tripod because things are really spot on. I have time to really judge and get it perfect. And it does slow you down, but being more thoughtful can be a very good thing in photography. And so just a few photographs that I would never have been able to take with my phone are pictures like this because I mounted it on a tripod. I guess you can mount a phone on a tripod these days, but you have limitations on the controls. And so you can see how long the shutter was open in these cases, and you're just not going to handhold in those situations. This one, in fact, was taken right in the middle of the day. So it's not like it's really that low light, but I wanted this blurriness in here. That was my choice. And in order to do that, I needed a 1-second exposure, which means I needed a tripod. When you are using a tripod, it's often very helpful to have a cable release so that you can fire the camera. A shortcut trick is to use the 2-second self-timer on your camera. That way you're not touching the camera while it's actually firing. All right, so reviewing our shutter speeds here. Why are we going to choose a specific shutter speed? There are technical reasons why we might choose a faster one or a slower one simply to let in more or less light. When I shoot a landscape shot, I'm generally not concerned about the shutter speed because the landscape's not going anywhere. When I'm shooting the cross-country runners, I am very concerned about shutter speed, and it is of primary importance. Do I want to do a fast one and freeze their motion, or do I want to choose something a little bit slower? All right. Time in class for a quiz, and I see that a lot of you have pad and paper out. Perfect. What I want you to do is write down 1, 2, 3, 4 on that pad and paper. And everyone at home, you can follow along as well. Just get a piece of paper out, write 1, 2, 3, 4. This is a very easy quiz. It's multiple choice. All of the answers are right here. Okay? So here are your questions. I want you to pick a good shutter speed for stopping the motion of a basketball player. And we're going to assume they're playing basketball. Okay? Blurring a waterfall. So we talked about those blurry waterfall shots. How about hand holding a 35 millimeter lens? And finally, this is a tricky one. This is extra points here. Hand holding a 400 millimeter lens with 3 stops of stabilization. And so I'm thinking, Kenna, Susan, what we should do is maybe either ask a question or you can read a comment or we can just chat. Give them a moment and then we're going to come back and get their answers.
Well, what we can do is give you some of the guesses. Earlier you asked us what the fastest shutter speed and camera
let's
out
go
there
back
was.
to that one.
All right, let's go back to that one. I know we had a few answers.
We did.
So there was...
well, camera guy I'll start with
Yeah,
camera
yeah,
guy.
go.
Camera guy said Maxim 9 SLR, and it was 1/12,000th of a second.
Bingo, they got it. That is it.
Really?
Right, nice job. Now, do you have other answers?
We do.
We do.
What do you have?
We have George Lean, and not sure if this is the same camera, but it's the Minolta 9XI at 1/12,000th.
Oh, wait. Susan, I may have jumped, because what camera did you say?
I said the Maxim 9.
You know, I've run past the slide that has my secret information hidden
Did
notes.
John stump himself? Is that actually
It is a
possible?
Minolta camera, and it is a Maxim. I don't think it would. I think it was like what's.
One says 9, one says 9XI. They're both saying 1/12,000th of a
I
second.
think it was the 9XI. I can check after.
Maybe
the
they're
break.
both right.
No, one of them's right, one of them's wrong.
Okay.
We did also have, though, DMF Photography said it was the Nikon D1 that can do 1/16,000th.
That is true, and so they get points as well. I was thinking more of the regular SLRs, but that was kind of a special one because that and where it falls into a different category is that camera doesn't have a full frame sensor, and so because the smaller size area, the shutter is able to travel across a smaller area faster.
Just can't underestimate the knowledge of the creative live community.
Yes.
We
Now
also exactly, and we also had a lot of votes for the Mamiya having a 1/12,000th, not a specific camera.
Right.
So.
I'm trying to think of which model and/or because their standard cameras did not have it. It might have been a leaf shutter, but it wasn't a standard 35 millimeter full frame camera. But some great stuff. Nice job, guys.
Sweet.
All right, back to this.
Okay, so let's check back with our in-studio audience. All right, do we have a volunteer to answer the question of what would be a good shutter speed for stopping the motion of a basketball player?
500.
500th of a second? Check the answers. Yes, I said 500th of a second would be good. 1,000 wouldn't be a bad choice. Anything beyond that is kind of really more than it's necessary, or you're going to blur the motion. So very good answer there. All right, how about somebody else for blurring a waterfall? What sort of shutter speed would you choose? Who would like to answer this one?
1 or 2 seconds?
What's that?
1 or 2 seconds?
1 or 2 seconds. I think that is an excellent answer, so good job there. 1 second is a good place to go, and I've done it up to 30 seconds. And so it's kind of 1 second you start getting into a really, really good zone there. All right, what if you're hand holding a 35 millimeter lens? Melissa, you want to go with this one?
Well, I would say 1/30th.
35 is going to be closest to, yes, a 30th of a second. And so that one's fairly easy, but you know, it's just that one over the focal length in generalities. Okay, now this one's extra tough. And hand holding a 400 millimeter lens with 3 stops of stabilization. Did anyone figure this one out? Does anyone have like a really good guess that they just want to throw out?
I did 1/30th.
1/30th of a second. How did you figure that out?
I went to the closest, which is the 500, and then 3 stops down. 3. So I figured between the 250, 500, 3 stops down.
Okay. So
I said 30.
I ended up with
60,
a 60th of a second, but she has exactly the right thought process, which is what's the closest shutter speed? And then I can go 1, 2, 3 stops down. So that would be a 60th of a second. You could hand hold that. So very good. Nice job.
Could you please repeat that just again, that whole concept? So the 400 millimeter lens.
Forget the stabilization. Just go with 400.
Okay.
400, 500 is the closest number.
Okay.
It's the slightly safer one because it's a little bit faster, but we're going to go with the closest one. And then each of these are stops, so we're going to go 1, 2, 3 stops down.
Okay.
Yep.
Can I just make a comment?
Yes.
The first time I saw your fundamentals of digital photography, this concept went just right over my head. And I think that's why there's so many moving parts to this course and there's so many things to learn in photography. I think it was probably 1.5 years or 2 years after I'd started shooting that this concept actually sunk in with me, and it changed my photography. So it's amazing to me all of the moving pieces and how they soak in at different. But this is a good.
It's one of those sections, I think, for people newer into photography, kind of bookmark it, come back in a month or two, and you'll go, oh, I didn't get that the first time around.
Which is what happened to me, so very cool.
Are there any other follow-up questions on shutter speeds?
Absolutely.
Because we do have camera details, which is going to take a little bit of time.
Okay.
So we don't
Let's
have
just
too
do
much time for
one
questions.
or two then. And do you have any in the studio audience? And then we can go to Wolfie Wolf.
Wolfie Wolf's question, I'm looking for it now. Oh, there it is. Okay. So I know you love moon questions. questions about shooting the moon, John. They always
Yeah.
seem to come to you. Wolfie Wolf had asked, what shutter speed do you recommend to take a zoom photo of a full moon on a clear, crisp night to get a sharp image?
Okay. Their question could have been asked a little bit better, because the zoom shot doesn't help me out, because I have wide-angle zooms and telephoto zooms. But they are exactly spot on in that plays a factor in it. Because if you're going to shoot a wide-angle shot of the whole night sky and a little tiny moon, you could go with a pretty long shutter speed. If you're going to take one of those 800-millimeter lenses and point it at the moon, then you're going to need a much faster shutter speed, because the moon is much bigger in the frame. And I don't know that I can have an answer for this, because it depends on how close in on the moon you are. I know that I have used some of these really big lenses, and you take a big doubler on these lenses. Oh, this feels so good. And you're going to be filling the entire frame with the moon, and you're going to be limited to maybe a quarter of a second, which is really tough. That's a fast shutter speed for that in some ways.
Great.
20,000.
I
40,000.
know you love that thing.
60,000.
Nice, John.
80.
Don't
Okay, I'm $100,000. There we go.
Yeah, don't strain
Shout out
yourself.
to Glazers, by the way, glazerscamera.com, where you can rent these guys. Wow.
So, John, there were quite a few questions about how to adjust your ISO with your shutter, and instead of asking you the question and having you say, there's a slide for that, I just thought I would let everyone at home know that we do have your questions, and we are going to be talking about that later today, so we'll save that question about ISO for the ISO section.
Right. So something else I didn't say before, my fault. Photography is really challenging to teach because there are three critical components: shutter speed, ISO, and aperture. And they all play a part, and they all affect and are impacted by the other one. But I don't know how to explain all three simultaneously. So I explain one at a time, and then we combine and work with all of them together. And so we will get in, talk about each of the other components, and then we're going to combine them all and mix them up into one happy party. Okay? So I think we're going to move on because we got some more stuff to deal with. And I don't even know what to call this section, but I call it camera details, and it's all the other stuff in the camera that you need to deal with. And we're going to try to limit it to things that are going to be in most cameras that are very important. First and foremost, the file types that your camera creates. So with digital cameras, it records information on the sensor, but it needs to convert it into a digital electronic form that we record. The two common systems are JPEG and RAW. With the JPEG system, it starts with the original information from the sensor, and then it goes through a processing phase. And this is where it kind of determines the final look of the image. And it's going to adjust the contrast and the white balance and a number of other things, as you can see here. After that, it's going to go through a compression to help reduce the size so that you can get more pictures on a memory card or more pictures on a hard drive. When you go through the compression, what it's doing is it's throwing out what it thinks is needless information. So if you have a blue sky that has pixels that are each, one little shade of blue off, it might say, well, rather than 6 shades of blue, you probably only need 3 shades of blue. Or if you compress it even more, because cameras have different levels of compression, you only need 2 shades of blue. And so you are throwing away color information that you're not going to see in your typical Facebook photo. But if you decide to print it up on a large print and put it on the wall, then you might start noticing those differences. Or if you want to go in and you want to edit those images and work on them, you might want that sort of information. The advantage of the JPEG is you get this really convenient size little package. You can email it to everyone, and they can all open it up and see it. You can put it on your website. You can upload it to any other website that you want. It's the common format that we exchange photos in. And it's a very efficient system. Long term, I think JPEGs may go away. But I think it's very long term because it's a compressed file that we're losing data on. And serious photographers do not want to throw good data away. And so we have raw images. And what's happening here is that we start with the sensor and we get the original information. It does need to go through a raw converter, so it still needs to convert this information into an electronic format. The camera does add white balance. Whatever white balance you have set on your camera, it will put on there. But the cool thing is it's removable and changeable. So if you screwed up out in the field, you could redo it later. And this is there's hardly anything that you can do in photography where you screw it up in the field and you can fix it later without any damage at all. And this is one of the only ones that you can do that with. From here, you end up with a raw file. And Different camera companies like Canon and Nikon have their own proprietary RAW file, and you can kind of think of this as their own proprietary language that they speak in. And if you email your best friend a RAW image, they're just going to say, what the, I can't see anything, all right? Because they probably don't have the right software for it. And so what we have to do is we have to use some sort of software to turn this into a JPEG so that we can send it to them. Now, your cameras are going to come with software, or you can use other programs. I like to use Adobe Lightroom, Photoshop, and there's multitudes of other programs that will read all these RAW photos. And the reason we're shooting the RAWs is that we can always go back to them and work with them. So let me go to this next one here. So JPEGs are processed and compressed. RAWs are unprocessed original data. I think a good analogy is food. Do you like your food processed and compressed? Or do you like raw vegetables? What do you think's better for you? Okay? So the JPEGs are very convenient, and I work with JPEGs all the time because I'm going to upload some images to my website, or I want to send somebody a photograph of something. I'm going to use a JPEG. But I shoot in RAW because I want to keep all the original data, and I don't want to throw anything away. And here, keeping all the important information. As I mentioned at the beginning of this class, part of my preparations for the class is I wanted my images to look as good as possible. I went back to the original RAW images, and I used the new software that I have and my new eyes and brain and what a picture should look like, and I've redeveloped the photograph. It's kind of like the old days of film, keeping the negative around. Most people, hardly anyone, would throw their negatives away because they have prints. You want to keep the negatives because you go back to the originals. Now, we do have the problem of larger file sizes, which is really not a big deal these days. You can buy big, large memory cards that hold thousands of raw files without a problem. The main problem is that it can't be read by some software. And so you need to have your computer download system in place that works for you. There are some people that just don't have this set up, and I tell them, shoot JPEG for now, but plan on shooting RAW. And so if you're serious about photography, you should either shoot RAW or plan on shooting RAW. Now, there are always exceptions to the rules. The cross-country photos that I shoot in JPEG. I just shoot so many of them, I just don't want to fill up my hard drive with thousands and thousands of raw photos, of which I'm making 5x7s and putting into a simple slideshow. I know the final use of them, and I'm shooting so many of them. There are reasons for shooting JPEGs, but on all my serious work, I like to shoot in RAW. And a good example of why I do this is because you get a greater exposure range with RAW. Down in the slot canyons in Arizona, you're going to have some very high contrast situations of bright brights and dark darks. The image you get off the back of your camera is not 100% accurate to what you are going to get. You're limited by the quality of the LCD screen. In this case, you can see the clipped highlights and the clipped darks. If I take an image in JPEG, I can take it into Photoshop or Lightroom and I can adjust it. And you can see I've still lost some of these shadow areas and a lot of the highlights. But if I shoot that image in RAW and I take it in, the only thing I'm losing here is, where is it? Just a little bit here and a little bit here. I'm able to pull back and rescue some of that data. And so if you're unsure about the exposure, and it's kind of a really wide area, RAW is definitely going to help you out quite a bit there. If you've nailed down exposure, the JPEGs can do all right, but this is one of the great reasons I can go back and work with the original light, you might say. All right. In your camera, for setting this, there's going to be a quality setting or something of that nature. And you're going to have the option of large, medium, and small. You're probably going to want the large. You bought a 20 megapixel camera, you might as well use it all 20 megapixels. If you do shoot JPEG, we have a compression adjustment. You remember the little blue pixels in the sky example. Many cameras will give you a number of different options. Canon has this little smooth line, which is a high quality setting, or it's got this little stair-step line, which is low quality. If you have a Nikon camera, they have it, and they call it fine, normal, and basic. And it's the compression settings that they have, so they have 3 choices. And in general, you're going to want to choose the highest quality setting for the highest quality photographs. Now, if you do choose to shoot RAW, there are often options for different types of RAWs. A full RAW, which is the full resolution, or a small RAW, which still gets you all that raw color information, but in a smaller file size. Not too many people shoot this. There are maybe, a good example, but it might be a catalog shooter. You're going to shoot pictures for the Gap. Ooh, I hope I can say that in here. You're going to shoot pictures of khaki pants, and they have to have just the right color of khaki, so you need the right color information. But it's just going to be in a little catalog, and the pictures are never going to be very big. That would be a reason for shooting small RAW. Most people won't be shooting small RAW, though. One of the other options you have is you can shoot RAW plus JPEG. This is for the undecided. I can't choose. What do I want to do? All right, so in this case, you're getting 2 pictures every time you press the shutter release once. And this, in many ways, is just going to clutter up your hard drive and cause problems. And so I don't recommend this unless you have a very specific reason. A specific reason might be I'm shooting a wedding. I want the highest quality photographs possible. That's the RAW. But I also want to put a slideshow together at the reception, and I don't have time to download and process the RAW images. That's where you would use the JPEGs. And so tend not to want to use this, as I say, unless you have a very, very good reason to it. Now, the buffer in your camera has been put there so that you can shoot pictures faster. Now, on old cameras, here's the way digital cameras worked. The sensor got the image, and then it went through an image processor, and then it got stored on your memory cards. And anyone who started in digital photography about 10 years ago know that it was a very slow process, because you'd have to wait for the camera to be ready for the next shot. And it was processing and trying to store that information. And so they decided to speed things up. What they would do is on their cameras, they would put in a little buffer. And so they installed some very fast RAM memory on your camera. And now when you shoot pictures in your camera, it just throws them very quickly into the buffer. And it can do this as quickly as the camera can shoot. And so we're going to throw a bunch of images into our buffer here. And then the camera will process those images and store them to the memory card when and where it's convenient for the camera to do it. Now, in reality, it starts processing these images as soon as they get in there, okay? But it might fill up. And so what you can do on your camera is you should check it out to see how many images you can shoot in the buffer. And for most people, here's how you do it at home. Take your camera, turn it on. Look through the camera, and in the bottom right-hand corner is a number, usually in some brackets, and that's the buffer number. Not on all cameras. It depends on the camera. They don't tend to do it on the mirrorless cameras. I don't know why. But the SLRs, like if you pick up your typical Canon Rebel, it'll say 9, which means you can shoot 9 shots very quickly into the buffer. And so if you're into sports photography, if you are shooting action shots, you want really fast shooting, what you want to look at in a camera is the buffer size. And this is buried in the specification somewhere. You'll want a card that has very fast speed and how fast it can read and write this information here. And then the processing of the camera should be very fast as well, too. These aren't things that most people look at, and to be honest with you, for general photography, it's not that important. It's only if you shoot a lot of sports where this comes into importance. So, continuing on that thought, the cards that are out there, the standard for quite a while was the compact flash, and they're in fewer and fewer cameras, and I think we'll see it possibly fade away a little bit. The standard card in most cameras these days is the secure digital card. Obviously, size, I'm not going to get into that. That's pretty easy. There is a speed of the card. This is how fast information can be written to the card and pulled off the card. For most people, it's not a big deal. If you work for Sports Illustrated and you're shooting the Super Bowl and they're downloading pictures every 5 minutes, then it's a big deal. They've tried to simplify things on the new SD cards by giving them a simple number so that we can see how fast one card is versus another card. And it was pretty good until they reached 10, and then they decided to go back to 1. So 1 is faster than 10 because it's a UHS card. And this has to do with how many megabytes it can read per second. And there's a couple of new cameras that are just coming out that are at the UHS Class 2, so they're very fast in reading and writing information. For your standard photographer, don't even worry about this. I said I wasn't going to talk about it, but if you shoot video, your camera uses data much more quickly and intensively. You need something faster. Most cameras need at least a 6 or higher, but you'd be well advised probably to get 10 or higher if you're shooting a lot of video. All right, so when you take pictures on your memory cards, what's really happening is your camera establishes a folder system, and it puts pictures within a folder. As you go from one shot to the next and you take the pictures home, you download them, and then you delete them on the memory card, you end up with all these kind of empty folders. And these empty folders can occasionally cause a communication problem with the camera. And the way to deal with this is that you should be formatting your memory card on a regular basis. So the standard practice for a serious photographer is they go out and they shoot, they come home, they download, they back up, they put the card back in the camera, they go to something in the menu that is in all cameras called Format, and they format the memory card. And what that does is it cleans everything. I call it cleaning with Clorox. It really just gets rid of everything, and you start fresh again. You'll get more life from your camera if you do this on a regular basis. The drive mode controls what happens when you press down on the shutter release on the camera. Most of the time, we're going to be in the single shot mode. If you're shooting sports, you're going to want to be in the continuous mode. Some of the more advanced cameras have high speed and low speed options, but that varies quite a bit by camera. And this is also likely where you are going to find the self-timer. And so we have 10-second self-timers. We have the 2-second self-timer, which I mentioned before. If you're on a tripod and you don't want to touch the camera when it's shooting, you press the button. 2 seconds later, the vibrations settle out and the camera is perfectly steady. And many cameras will have a little wireless remote that you can use so that you can have all the time in the world to get in the shot. Another little setting that's going to be buried in your menu system is the color space. What we can see with our eyes is much greater than what we can capture with our cameras. And most cameras, in fact, I think all cameras, come set standard to sRGB. It's just a standard color space. One of the options you can do is you can switch it to Adobe RGB. If you shoot RAW, you get Adobe RGB. So you don't have to ask or do anything about it. It is a larger color space. But if you shoot JPEG only, you can choose one or the other. My tendency is to shoot the largest color space possible. But if you're, a very simplistic shooter, you shoot really basic pictures, you take them down to the drugstore to have 3x5 prints made, and that's all you do with it. You don't plan on editing your images or working with them on the computer in any way. The sRGB might be a little bit simpler to use just because the camera does the color conversion for you. But I think for most of our serious photographers, you're going to want to go with Adobe RGB. There is a very, very subtle difference in the color that you're going to see in the photographs. Next up is white balance. This is the color of light that we are recording. Different types of light sources, whether it's the sun or a candle or a tungsten light, they're going to have a different color light that is emanating from that light source. And the color of that light is going to impact the subject that we are shooting. So it's something that you should be aware of. In your camera, there is a number of different ways of controlling the white balance. There's going to be a number of different settings in here. They have usually a sunlight, cloudy, and a shade setting for slightly different types of natural lighting situations. For artificial lighting, under tungsten lights, which is what a lot of us have in our homes, you're going to want to switch it over to incandescent or tungsten lighting to get a more natural, normal lighting in there. Flash, of course, is balanced the same way as cloudy. We'll also have a few other options. All right, this one gets a little geeky. We can get nerdy every once in a while. Kelvin setting. If you know the Kelvin temperature, you can set it in here. And that might seem kind of far-fetched, but if you work in a standard environment on a regular basis, you're going to know. I bet you these camera guys know what Kelvin temperature they're working at and what these lights are in here. And they have their cameras calibrated so that when they switch from this camera to that camera, the cameras have the same look to them. And so if you are shooting with multiple cameras, you would want to maybe manually go in and make sure they're exactly the same. If you didn't know, what you could do is you could photograph a white sheet of paper or something neutral in color, and the camera would figure out what the color is for you. You're going to need to go into your instruction manual to get the full details on how to do it, but it's a possibility in most intermediate and higher level cameras. And then there's auto. So auto white balance will just kind of look at your scene and try to pick the best choice for you. And you might get the feeling that I'm not a big fan of auto, but auto white balance works pretty good. And I choose it a lot of the time because it does a pretty good job. And secondly, I shoot RAW most of the time. And if I shoot RAW, I can fix it later without any negligible effects other than the time to change it. So if I take a picture with really wacky color, like this one, I can go into Lightroom and I can grab the slider and drag it over to the yellow slide and just kind of figure out where's the right balance between the yellow and the blue settings. And so it's very simple and easy to do, and you can do hundreds of shots all at the exact same time, so it doesn't really take much time at all. And so if you shoot RAW, it's not as important, but whenever I am shooting, even if I'm shooting RAW, if it's really wacky color, I'm going to make that change. I would rather make that change at the time I'm shooting than later. So my recommendations are auto white balance, and then when you notice a problem, change it appropriately. A couple of other just minor things. Your camera records the time and date. And when I put this class together 3 months ago, I was trying to estimate exactly what time of day it would be when I was doing this. I thought it would be 11:45. We're running a little bit late. We're at 12:20. But you want to make sure you have this right, because when you download your pictures, this goes into the metadata. It's not on your photograph. It's associated with the photograph. And it's very good for reconstructing what you were doing and where your photographs were taken. Now, another little thing buried in your camera is the firmware. This is the software that runs the operation of your camera. When a camera first gets released, it often has a firmware version of 1.00. And then as they make updates to it, like 1.01 is a pretty minor update. Maybe they fixed a language misspelling in the Czechoslovakian language option in the camera. And then they might make a further change, 1.10. There's a little metering adjustment that they figured to make it a little bit better. And then maybe they make a major adjustment and it becomes a 2.0 version. And these updates are free. Here's the websites you can go to. They'll eventually get you to the right location. You're going to need to do a little bit of hunting around to find out where they store the firmware update. Sometimes you have to go to the camera and then it goes there. Or sometimes you have to go to service and support and downloads to find out what the current firmware version is, but in all cases, it's a free firmware adjustment. One of the reasons why I really like Fuji is that they have gone to really great effort to offer firmware upgrades. They're the only company that I know that has offered firmware upgrades for a camera that's been discontinued to improve the performance of it. And so that's kind of a cool thing, and it's free, so it's worth the time to go in and check out. Something that we really don't have time to talk about in this class is the custom functions of each and every camera on the market. There's a lot of different ways where you get to customize your camera. This is something I do in the Fast Start camera classes. We go through every item in your camera. But there are all these different settings where you get to really customize and tweak your camera to work the way that you like it to work. So those are some of the most important features that you're going to want to go through and check in your camera. And this, finally, brings us to the conclusion of the camera section.
Dun, 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 dun. Does anyone have any questions? All right, we do have questions online. I'll start. The Bard from Ballarat said, where is the CMYK on the color space? Where does that fit in, CMYK?
CMYK, well, your camera is recording in red, green, and blue, RGB. CY, cyan, magenta, yellow, and black is K, because we ran out of letters. And so that's more of a printing system and colors that are choice in printers. And so that is just a rat's nest, hornet's nest, Pandora's box of converting from RGB to CYMK. And we're not going to touch that.
There's a class for that.
There's a long class for that
There's
one.
a color management
But it has
class.
to do with converting over to printing.
Yeah.
Sweet.
Awesome. Thank you. Oh, yep, Dina.
When you were talking about changing that shot you had of the bird, you were changing the
White balance.
The white balance. Thank you. Could you also have done that, just changing the exposure on your Lightroom? Would it give a different effect if you increase the exposure as opposed to just going down and changing the white balance?
I could change I could change the exposure, absolutely, yes, but that's not going to change the color.
Oh, okay.
And so that's what was wrong with that photograph. So I could isolate that aspect and fix that one thing.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
All right, well, we'll ask another question. Let's see. A Shinson image plus PCB Tom. Shinson image says, doesn't deleting folders as well as deleting images clean the SD card? And then PCB Tom said, can you format in camera or not your computer, or what do you recommend? What does it make a difference?
Right. So let me answer the second one first. It is best to format in the device that you are using that product. And so in this case, you're using the card in the camera. So the best device to format in is in the camera. You can format on your computers, but it's better to do it in the camera that you're using it in. Something related that's important to know is if you are switching cards between cameras, the safe choice is to reformat before you start using it in that camera. So if your buddy who has a Canon and you have a Nikon and he gives you a memory card, I would reformat it before you start using it on a regular basis.
All right, we have another one. We have a conversation going on about when you're shooting black and white. and white balance. So Wolfie Wolf's question was, I like to shoot a lot of black and white photos. Does white balance really matter in that situation?
If you're shooting RAW, definitely no. And if you're shooting in JPEG, it potentially could. It might depend a little bit on the camera itself.
That makes sense. Cool.
All right. Well, I think we're ready to go to break. Is this a good place for you to stop?
Yeah. So I'll just mention, just for people, because I've been referring to these other camera classes, and at Creative Live, I've done a bunch of other classes. So if you see your camera model up on screen, I have a class, or I will have a class, in the finer workings of that particular camera. That gives us, they're usually about 4 or 5 hour classes where we have time to really dive in to the peculiarities of that camera, that focusing system, you know, all that menu system, all those custom functions. And in these classes, you get a handout, downloadable PDF that even has my recommendations on how to set up the menu system for all those custom functions and so forth. And since I'm promoting my stuff, I have another class here that's kind of completely different than everything else. It's a travel photography class. And so if you love travel photography and you're kind of looking for more focused information on travel photography, both planning of trips, choosing equipment, and so forth, this is a class I think you would very much enjoy. I also share with you 10 of my favorite locations that I've been for photography reasons.
Great. All right, well, we're going to take a 45-minute break now, so let's talk about what we're going to do when we come back from break. John.
Well, as we step our way through, we've checked off one item off the list, and we're going to be talking about the image sensor. So we're going to be talking about sensor sizes and the battle between 4/3 and APS-C and full frame and those other questions about people will have in there.
5 days. We have 5 days of education.
1 out of 10. Section 1 out of 10.
All right. Well, we have some internet love, and I loved what Lefty said. We were asking how people found Creative Live, and Lefty said, looking through YouTube and found John Gringo. He had me at hello. Aww, I love that. That's so sweet.
You know what I wish they would have said?
What?
He had me at click.
There's a quote for the quote contest.
There's more of a John Gringo quote. All right, Starbucks35 said, this is my first Creative Live class, and I wasn't going to purchase, but I'm now realizing the quality. I'm definitely purchasing because I can't join in the next few days. So perfect candidate.
Well, thank you
for
very
someone,
much. Appreciate that.
Yes, who needs to buy if you're not going to make all 5 days. And JWood72 said he goes over so much, you're going to have to go back and reference something. $99 is a deal for this course. So really cool.
Well, it's always great to see people who have been part of the Creative Live family for a long time and those people that are new as well. Just a reminder how Creative Live works is, again, like these folks said, we're free when we're live, but you can also get anytime access to all 10 sections. Truly, so much the fundamentals here of digital photography, and you can get anytime access again for $149. However, when you buy it during the live event itself, that is only $99. And like Jay Woods and Starbuck35
Yep.
have said, we're already seeing, we actually saw a lot of people buying the class before it even started and posting that on Facebook.
They knew what was coming.
That's just an incredible testament to this class and to John's teaching that people know they have to buy it in advance. And then that gives you sort of the freedom of, I know I don't need to sit here and watch it for the whole 5 days, and I can go back and see what I want.
I'm sure a lot of people's hands are hurting right now from writing so much.
Seriously, we have seen that in the chat rooms. Anyhow, folks, thank you for joining us for this first segment. We've talked all about the camera. Next is going to be the sensor. Dun, dun, dun. All right. We'll see you back in 45 minutes, everyone. Thank you, John Gringo.
My name is
Welcome back, everyone, to Creative Live. We are here on day 1 of a 5-day class that is the fundamentals of digital photography with John Gringo. There was so much that we went over today. How many slides did we get through already? I think 200 something.
I'm not sure, but it's about 500 slides a day, 250 a section. Some are heavier than others.
If you're just joining us again, this is a 5-day class, kind of broken out, though, into 10 segments. So it was the camera earlier today, and now we're moving into the sensor, correct?
Yes.
We had a fun pre-show earlier today. If you guys weren't with us in the beginning of the day, we've been starting at 8:45 Pacific time, 15 minutes before the broadcast starts, and trying to bring you guys in behind the scenes here at Creative Live, talk about the family. So this morning, Susan and I talked about how we got started here at Creative Live, how we first found out about Creative Live. And it was fun to go down memory lane. And we had folks in the chat rooms who were also talking about how they got into Creative Live. But what we didn't ask yet is how John Gringo got into Creative Live.
Well, there is actually a bit of a funny story about that. I was assisting Art Wolf, and Art was no longer going to be using the classroom as a classroom, and he rented it out to Creative Live. So Creative Live moved in, and the owner of Creative Live went up to the manager and says, I know Art's really busy, but do you know someone else that could teach a photography class? Mm-hmm. And they said, well, you should check out his assistant, John, because he teaches a class. And so Craig said, well, okay, where can I see him teach? She goes, well, he's teaching a class at the Sheraton Hotel, and I was doing this. It was a horrendous project. I was teaching these hour-long classes at the Sheraton Hotel. And I have this one class, and we had a pretty good number of students, and Craig came in, and I kind of knew that he was coming in to
scope you out,
check me out. And so I start giving this class, and I'm doing my class, and about 10 minutes in, Craig stands up and he leaves. And I'm like, that's probably not a good sign. Anytime your critic gets up in the middle or that close to the beginning and just leaves. And so I thought I was just horribly terrible for what he was doing. But it was actually just the opposite. He knew after 10 minutes, okay, he's met my minimum standard. And then he had me do one little class, and that led to another and another, and here we are.
That is funny. Yeah, I have actually been with Craig when he's done that before.
Oh, yeah.
We've scoped out other instructors, and it's pretty cool because you can tell within 10 minutes if somebody is going to be good at what they're doing or great. So that's funny.
Can I just interject?
Yes,
I
please,
doubt
Susan.
that you met the bare minimum requirements. I'm pretty sure you surpassed his wildest expectations. So.
Fantastic. Yeah, absolutely. And so I want to give a shout out, again, people have been sharing their stories, so to Anoop Dubai, because Anoop Dubai is here just about all the time, at least when I'm hosting or in the chat room. So Anoop says, Creative Live is the best top-rated university for photography. When I started my first lessons, I got to know about Creative Live from doing a Google search. And for 4 years, every day that I tune into Creative Live, I learn something new. Anoop in Dubai is a commercial photographer, and that's all he needs to say. So great. It's really great to see where other people found Creative Live on Twitter. So again, continue to give us your stories of how you found Creative Live, and we're having fun reading those out.
Excellent.
All right, the sensor.
That's right.
Dun, dun, dun. I don't know why that is. All right, John, over to you.
Okay. So, folks, it's time to get started. And in this section, we're going to be talking about the sensor. It is a part of the camera, but it has such a big impact on the pictures and the camera styles and a lot of other factors. It requires a whole section on itself. But before we get into the section, I want to have a little fun, okay? And so I would like to let these new photographers know what their photographer's life is going to be like. And so I'm going to do it in a way that charts it, okay? And I will have to admit that I found a chart on the internet and I've kind of tweaked it to my own. And so you start with a point and shoot, and then you go to the SLR, and eventually you will get your tripod and your second SLR, and then you live a long life of lenses, 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 until, well, the very bitter end, okay? Then over here on the side, we're going to measure your skill level, how good you are at various things. Now, the first thing that we're going to look at is your knowledge level. And nobody is born knowing it all, so you do start down here. We all do. And as we use the green auto zone, we don't learn much. But then when we take our first photography class and we start working manual, we're going to learn a lot more. But every time we get new equipment, we got to take a workshop, or we got to take a class, or we got to read a book. Every time new software comes out, we need to re-educate ourselves. And so it is a constant battle against all these new techniques and styles and products that come out. So just be aware that just because you took one class doesn't mean you're done taking classes. Next up, the quality of photographs that you take. I don't know of anyone that starts out taking great photos. It just doesn't happen. It takes a while to learn what you are doing. After you take your first photography class, you will likely see a little spike upwards, but you're likely to see a spike downwards after that. You kind of get caught up. It's that phase, what do they say, enough knowledge to be dangerous. All right, that's what tends to happen. But it will eventually parallel your knowledge level. So the more you know, the better you will get. The third and final area is how good you think you are. Now, for some reason, non-photographers think that they would be really good photographers. And it's just that that's not what they've chosen to do. And as soon as they start shooting, they start realizing this is not as easy as I thought it would be. And so a lot of photographers have a very low self-esteem about their photographs. But once they get better and they do start shooting better, they will feel better. But you are no doubt going to have a bad day, and then you will have a good day, and then you'll have another bad day, and then somewhere you'll be wavering in here. And if it's a pretty good life, you will end up at least feeling all right about yourself. All right, so in this section, we're going to be dissecting the sensor in many, many different ways. And so first, let's just talk about the sensor itself, obviously. If we were to take our lens off the camera, let's get this lens off the camera. There we go. And behind that mirror that we talked about, and behind that shutter unit, there is the sensor in our camera, and this is what is recording light. And as I mentioned briefly before, there are lots of different sensor sizes. And so let's bring out some of the more popular sensor sizes and some cameras that they are in. There we go. Yeah, we'll throw out the phone out there anyway, over there at the right. And so we have all these different sensor sizes, and it's easiest to explain these if we just start with the largest, which is based off of 35 millimeter film. Now, 35 millimeter film, for the better part of about 50 years, was the most popular size film because it was something we could put into small cameras, and we could still get pretty big enlargements. There was other film sizes, but they were just not as popular during that time. When we switched from film to digital, for photographers like myself, it was very convenient simply to get a new digital camera and use my entire collection of lenses. Because the lenses are very well matched to the sensors, and so that's a big part we'll be talking about in this section. And so if a camera has a sensor of 36 by 24, it's known as a full frame sensor. And some people don't like the name full frame because there are sensors bigger than this. And so full frame is just a term that we use that says it's the same as 35 millimeter film. The downside to these sensors is that they cost a lot of money to make. And so to make less expensive cameras that we could more easily afford, they made smaller size cameras. And they made these smaller size sensors, and they made them, and they called them APS, which is really dumb, and I'm going to refer to that in a little bit. It stands for Advanced Photo System. And then Canon has their own version, which is just ever so slightly smaller in size. And then we have the Panasonic and Olympus 4/3 system, which uses yet a smaller size. The Nikon mirrorless, smaller again. And then the point and shoots use a variety of small sizes, as do the phones. And so this is the size difference. And something that bothers me is that this doesn't make any sense at all. We have numbers over here which are referring to tube sizes of TVs that were made. We have 4/3. Well, what does that mean? 2 words. CX. It's just 2 letters. And then we come over here. We're referring back to a film format that was started and finished in the 90s that nobody uses anymore. And then full frame. What's full about it? Well, it's the same as something else that's no longer being used near to the quantities that it used to be used. And so I would like to get rid of a lot of those, and I think a much, much simpler system would be if we just measure the diagonal of the screen. It's much, much simpler. And so in this case, it's 43 millimeters corner to corner. Okay? If we look at the APS, it's 28 millimeters corner to corner. This is a really simple system. This is how we measure this TV. 90 inches on this particular case. This is how we measure our monitors. It's a very simple comparative system. So not only do we know how big it is, we know how it compares with all the other ones. And there will be a little second advantage, and that is that this is also going to give us a little bit of reference when it comes to the lens choice. All right? So there's a little bit of a rule of thumb down here, and this is kind of my own rule of thumb. I haven't quite seen anyone else recommend this, but if you take your sensor size, that is a normal lens on your camera. All right? So with a full-frame camera, 43, we kind of round up and call it 50. 40 is pretty close, 45. If you have a 4/3 camera, they make a 25-millimeter lens. That would be a pretty good normal lens on your camera. And when I say normal lens, we will discuss it more in depth in the lens section, but it's kind of just what you see in front of you, not super wide angle, not telephoto. Take your sensor size and divide it by 2. I'm going to keep the math pretty simple here for you folks. Divide it by 2, that's going to be a good landscape lens. So for your full frame, take a 43, let's call it 22. That's going to be a pretty good wide angle for landscape photography. If you take your sensor size and you multiply it by 2, that's going to be a very nice portrait lens. So if you were to take an APS camera, 28 times 2, let's just round it off and call it a 50-millimeter lens. 50-millimeter lens is a pretty nice portrait lens for that cropped frame sensor. If you multiply it by 4, you're going to be getting into a pretty good sports lens. So let's go back to our full frame example, 43. Just for simplicity, let's round it up to 50. 50 times 4 gets us up to 200. So you're probably going to need a 200-millimeter lens for a lot of sports. And this is very generic. If anyone knows exactly what they're doing and they're saying, no, it should be really sensor size times 4.3, we're generalizing here, okay? And if you take it and you multiply it by 8, that's going to be a pretty good wildlife lens. And so if you're going to Africa on safari, 8 times the 50 here would put us up at 400 millimeters. But if you're using this, you only need about a 200-millimeter lens. And so that's just kind of a rule of thumb that you can think about is what lens would be appropriate for different situations. Now, for most of this section, we're going to concentrate on the most popular sensors that are in the more serious cameras. And that are the ones that we see here. So the full-frame sensor has a crop factor of 1.0 because it's the same size as 35-millimeter film. Canon, Nikon, Sony, and Leica are the only manufacturers right now that make cameras with this size of sensor in it. Cameras that are going to have the smaller size sensor, this APS sensor, Nikon, Sony, Pentax, and Fuji sensors are all this size here. Canon went with a slightly different route, and they went with a 1.6 crop. There's advantages and disadvantages to that, but it's just a little bit smaller. And then the 4/3 is smaller by a factor of 2. And so comparing focal lengths, this is the numbers that we're going to use to kind of compare what focal lengths are what. And it gets a little complicated, so I prepared a number of graphics, as you might expect. All right, we've got a full-frame sensor here, and we're going to use the entire image area on this, and we're going to take a nice wide-angle shot. Okay, so here's our shot. Now, let's switch over to a cropped frame camera, and we're going to leave the tripod and the exact same lens in the same position. We're just going to switch out cameras to a cropped frame camera. A 1.5 crop in this case is going to look like this because we're using a smaller sensor. All right, now you notice that we're not getting as much from side to side. That the picture isn't quite the same. We've lost a little bit. Let's see what we've lost here. We've lost everything around the edges here. All right, so that's the difference between a crop frame and a full frame sensor. Now let's kind of think about what we needed to use to get these shots. The full frame, in this case, let's say we needed a 35-millimeter lens in order to get this on a full frame camera. The crop frame camera, if you wanted to get the exact same image here, you're going to need a different lens. In this case, you're going to need a 20-millimeter lens. And, you know, I know a lot of you didn't tune in because you want to do math, but we got to do a little math, okay? So the math we got to do is pretty simple. 20 millimeters times the crop factor, 20 times 1.5, gets us back up here to the 35. And so if you have a cropped frame camera, you're going to kind of have to use this crop factor to figure out how that compares up here. Now, if you don't care what's going on with full frame, you don't need to do any math. You can just say, this is a 20 millimeter lens, this is what it looks like on my camera. But when you hear photographers talk in front of a public, they're probably talking about full frame cameras. When you read an article in a magazine, they're probably talking about recommended focal lengths, full frame equivalent, because that's the standard terminology that we've been using for the last 50 to 60 years. And that's what we're used to, and that's why we do it. So you can see in this case, in my opinion, the crop frame kind of ruined the picture because it was a nice wide-angle shot, and it went in and made a different shot. So let's take a look at this again in a different scenario. We're going to use our full-frame sensor, and now we're up on one of my Alaska cruises. I do a cruise up in Alaska, photography cruise. And you got this whale jumping out of the water, okay? Now, right next to you is somebody that has a 1.6 crop frame camera. And here's what they're getting. All right, so they're not getting all that extra area around it, and now the pixels of their sensor are more densely packed in on this subject. And so they're actually getting the preferred. You want the tighter shot here because it's a little bit further away. So if you want to get this type of shot with a crop frame camera and you want to come up on the cruise with me, I would recommend probably a 300 millimeter lens. You can get a very nice one here. 9 inches, 2.5 pounds, around $1,500. Now, let's say you wanted to upgrade to a full-frame camera. All right, you want to get that same close-up image with a full-frame camera. Well, back to the math, okay? So we're going to take our 300 millimeters. We're going to go by our crop factor, measure that out, and that brings us to 480 millimeters. And, oh, lucky for you, both Canon and Nikon make 500 millimeter lenses. They are twice as long, 3 times the weight, and 7 times the price. So there will be a price to pay for going full frame. Everyone talks about how great full frame is, but one of the things you have to realize is that you have to afford the lenses that go with it. In my mind, it's kind of like moving into a bigger home. You're like, oh, this is great. We have so much more space. And there's so much more vacuuming, and there's so much more painting, and the roof costs more, and the insurance costs more. All the costs go up. And so a big factor in full frame is the cost, because everything gets anteed up a bit. Okay, so let's take our full frame sensor, and what are we doing here? I've got to remember what I'm doing. Oh, yes. So full frame is great. It's awesome, right? Wouldn't you all like a full frame camera if you don't have one? How about bigger than full frame? And we can go bigger than full frame, and it doesn't make any sense in the naming protocol here. It's called medium format. Because back in the old days, we had large format Ansel Adams cameras, we had medium format, and then we had the little tiny 35 millimeter cameras. So if you want more, and we're not going to talk too much about this, Leica S makes a beautiful camera. It's got a 45 by 30 millimeter sensor, and I think that's a lot easier to figure out. It's just 54. So we've gone from 43 up to 54. Pentax has one of the most affordable medium format cameras out there. And if you really got the bucks, these are expensive here, you can get yourself a Hasselblad or a Mamiya Leaf, and these are going to have some of the largest sizes on the cameras. And so these are what some of the commercial photographers are out there using. And so if you see like a stunning shot of a Ferrari in a studio, they're probably using a medium format camera. Now, just in case anyone's curious, we were dealing with 43 millimeters, and this is kind of large, right? Well, for anyone shooting with a 4x5 camera, theirs is 162 millimeters. And so 43 in the big scope of things is pretty darn small. And if anyone was lucky enough to shoot with an actual 8x10 camera, well, that's a 320 millimeter. And if you remember the rule of thumb, a 320 millimeter lens would be their normal lens on that. All right? And so just kind of a little curiosity thing. I don't know that it's that important, but we got to have fun every once in a while.
Well, John, I think there are a lot of people who are still like going back to film and are really excited about those old processes. So it is amazing to see. I worked with some photographers that do large format photography, and Michael A. Smith was his name, had an 8x20 full frame camera, old school camera. And so I don't even know what the factor on that would be, but pretty impressive. Amazing, amazing.
Yeah. So let's just check in and see if there's any specific questions we can address regarding the basic sensor size.
Absolutely. So just a couple clarification questions. Another question from Tough Toodle, who says, so if I have a T3i and a 5D, and my longest lens is 200 millimeter, if I'm going on Safari, I'd be better off taking the T3i. Is that what you're saying?
Well, they're getting very specific. I was speaking more in general terms. And the problem is in their scenario, those two cameras are very different cameras. the performance features and other features are different. But with those two cameras, they're comparing a crop frame camera versus full frame. That 200 millimeter lens will get a larger image on the sensor with the Rebel camera than they will the full frame camera. And so I can't fully answer their question, which way would they be better off? But for the animals that are further away, they might be better off with the Rebel than the higher priced camera.
I think that's something that it really took me a long time to wrap my head around, and so I really appreciate that we're spending time on this. We did have a question from Susie Sunshine, who says, "Hi from the East Coast. Does the crop factor also affect compression, and how does that relate? Is there a factor like focal length?"
I'm trying to get exactly what they mean by that question. And the compression aspect is going to be affected by the focal length, and the focal length is affected by the sensor size. So yes, it would impact how much compression they're going to get in a shot. And I actually do have a slide for compression. I have a compression section, but that's not all the way until like section 10 in the composition section.
Okay.
But we will talk a bit more about that when we get into the lens section as well. So there's more information to come.
Okay, but there's not a standard, I see now what she's trying to say, a standard factor like the 1.6 that you could apply to compression and lenses.
Yeah, if you could rate compression in a number, you could multiply it by your crop factor, but I don't know how to do that.
All right, well, maybe somebody out there in the Creative Live community was going to go figure that out.
I think it's an interesting concept. So, we have a question in our studio audience.
So with the crop camera or sensor, are there certain sizes of reprints that are the limit that you could go for a print to hang on your wall if you wanted to go to, if you're using any one of those?
Right.
Because the sensor's so small, you can't blow that up past a certain size.
Right. Well, it's a shifting
standard.
It's a shifting standard. Okay, it's kind of like back on the days of 35 millimeter film. How large a print could you make? And a lot of photographers would make 16 by 20s, and that was kind of the limit. But other photographers would go 24 by 36. And so it kind of depends on your quality standards. In your specific question, it's going to depend on the lens, and it's going to depend on how many megapixels, and it's going to depend on the viewing distance from the print, and so there's a lot of factors that can get involved and get very, very complicated.
Okay.
But in general, the larger the sensor, the larger you could make the final print.
Okay. Thank you.
I think we're ready to move on to sensor size.
All right, so we're going to next, because there's a lot going on here and it affects a lot of the cameras and lenses, we're going to do some comparisons, and we're going to compare a number of different cameras. And just for preference, or just for your information, I shoot mostly with a full frame camera, but I do have a crop frame camera and I have mirrorless cameras, and I've been doing a lot of comparisons, so I'm going to give you a number of comparisons between the two that what we get. Now, in the very general sense, bigger versus smaller, bigger sensors are going to have bigger pixels, which are going to do better under low light conditions. We're generally going to have more space in which to put more pixels, all right? And then finally, we're going to be allowed to get shallower depth of field. And this is kind of a hard thing to bring up right now because we don't talk about lenses for a couple of sections, but there's just no way of getting around this. You're going to be able to do this because of the type of lenses that you can get on your camera. Now, with the smaller size, the smaller sensor means the camera is going to be quite a bit smaller in size, and we saw that with some of the mirrorless cameras. It's going to cost less money. It can get very, very complicated making large sensors if there's any sort of problem. It's going to give us more depth of field for good or for bad, depending on what we want. So let's do our first comparison, and I'm going to compare three different cameras. I'm going to go with the full frame camera versus a micro four thirds camera and a point and shoot camera. So the point and shoots use very small sensors. So let's take a look at just the weight difference between these cameras. How much is the camera going to weigh? And so this is a good idea of the overall volume of it. And if you just look at the overall profile of the camera, you can see how much bigger the full frame cameras and sensors. And good example of SLR with the mirror box housing in here versus the mirrorless camera with the much smaller camera body. Rotate it around. One of the other big differences that a lot of serious photographers take a good look at is how big are the buttons? How many buttons and what sort of access do I have with them? As we get into the smaller cameras, the frustrating thing is that some of these buttons are really hard to press, and they're just not made quite as well because they're in such a little small space. And so it's not as easy to work with once it's in your hand and shooting with it. So how much are you going to spend? Well, it depends on exactly which model you get, of course. But just real generally, you could spend $500, $1,200 US dollars. Full frame camera is going to cost you quite a bit more. And so just as a general idea of how these compare back and forth with each other. And so this is the things that a lot of people know about and they talk about and they get pretty easily. One of the areas of this that it gets debated would be a nice word in the forums and comment sections on the photography blogs and websites is the shallower depth of field. Okay? And they keep arguing back and forth about equivalent this, no, it's not equivalent, and so forth. And I just want to go in and talk a little bit more about that. And so in this case, I'm going to be comparing 4 sensors, full frame down to an 11 millimeter sensor, comparing the depth of field, how much you get if you use similar lenses. And so in this case, I'm shooting just in the studio with an f2.8 setting. Notice how out of focus the background is of this camera here in the background versus the point and shoot camera would be like this. If you had a phone, it would be even more in focus. And so the question aesthetically for you, the photographer, is do you want this more out of focus or less out of focus? And it depends on the scenario. If we're trying to separate our subject from the foreground and the background, this is way, way better. Okay? But sometimes we want to be able to see what's going on around our subject, and we don't want a paper-thin slice of in-focus area. We want to see more, in which case the smaller sensor could be an advantage in this scenario. Now, we can change our apertures to 5/6, and in each and every aperture, it's letting in the same amount of light. We'll get into this in an upcoming section. Same amount of light, but the amount of depth of field has changed simply because we have a different size sensor and we have a different lens on the camera. And as we change at any particular aperture, we're always going to have shallower depth of field with the large sensor and more depth of field with the smaller sensor. Now, we've reached the limit just because of the lens and camera combination I was testing this with, and we were able to stop down to f22 because it just happened to be an option on this lens. And so I can still get very good depth of field provided my lens has that option on it. And if we go back to the shallow depth of field option on the equipment that I was testing, the full frame sensor and the 4/3 sensor, I had some faster options. So I could go in, actually the APS-C as well, and I could shoot all the way down to 1.8 or 1.4. So now I have really good control over how much depth of field because I could get almost as much as that one or I can go super shallow. So you do have really good control on the full frame sensors if you like that shallow depth of field. All right, let's go out in the field and just try another little experiment. We have a 4/3 sensor on the right. I'm using a normal lens, wide open. Notice the out of focus background. Okay, how out of focus is that railing in the background when we go to a APS-C or a full frame sensor? And the absolute truth is that you're always going to get shallower depth of field with the full frame sensor. Now, how important is this? My guess is that if we just pulled somebody off the sidewalk who didn't know about photography, they would look at this and they would be hard-pressed to tell the difference between these images. We're starting to fight against some very small, subtle differences, but they can be very important. Photographers will fight over a very small difference. Okay, so those are our 3 sensors, and what type of lenses? Now I'm doing another test here, and I decided to do a little bit more of a telephoto test. And I was going to compare a telephoto lens, and so I took a little Panasonic 45-150, which I think is a nice little, pretty inexpensive lens, not too much money. I took the most comparable lens that I could get my hands on with an APS-C sensor, which is a little Fuji 55-200, which is a bit bigger in size. And I did compare it with a fairly high-end Canon lens. And so there's a huge difference in size and a rather large difference in cost as well. Now, there's a very big performance difference as well, but let's just take a look at some sample photographs. And in this case, we're trying to separate our subject from the background. And with the smaller frame sensors, these trees in the background, no, they're still kind of in focus. And so the larger your sensor, the more you'll be able to separate that subject from the background. And this is a really nice look if you're doing sports photography or portrait photography, where you've really blown that background out of focus, and you're going to have a lot more impact doing that on a full frame sensor. And so the kind of question is this good enough for what your needs are? If it's not, then you're going to have to go to a larger size sensor. Let's expand this out a little bit. All right, so you're going to spend around $600. You could get a camera body and lens for $600 to do this. So this picture costs you $600. All right? This one here, I can do it as well for $600. So you don't save any money going down to the smaller size. You just end up with a smaller size camera. That's the advantage to that. We're going to go full frame here. You could do a full frame camera with a 300 millimeter 5.6 lens. Cheapest I could find would be about $2,000 to get in to do that. Now, if you want to separate the background even more, we could go with an f4 lens, and that's going to cost you $3,000. So not that much more. But what if we want the most? We really want to get that shallow depth of field. We're going to be spending a bit more cash, guys. All right, so $7,500 to do this. And so I think it's kind of interesting to put a dollar figure on how out of focus you want the background to go. Because sometimes you're like, well, I would like this, but do I have $7,500 to make this happen? In a lot of cases, well, I'm just trying to get a picture of this. And this is kind of what happens to the newbie photographer, where I got it, and I got it for a cheap price. And then they start learning about shallow depth of field. And it's like, ooh, that looks exciting. Ooh, maybe that's better. And that's better. And that's better. And that's even better. And so you can get really carried away on this. Now, one of the areas that people have very specific questions is full frame versus the standard crop, which is APS. Okay? And so I'm going to do kind of an in-depth comparison between the two. First off, let's define the advanced photo system. This was a camera and film system introduced in 1996 in order to make photography easier. And what they did is they took your standard 35 millimeter frame, and they wanted to make smaller size cameras, so they came up with this smaller size image area. And they took that film and they put it in a really simple drop-in loading film system. And it was very easy to load the film, and it offered some new capabilities, which was kind of nice. Now, Nikon and Canon kind of have their own version of this, okay? And so Nikon went with a 1.5 and Canon went with a 1.6 ratio. And if you look at the very nitty-gritty details, it'll get you down to the 1/10 of a millimeter exactly what size the sensor is. And the Canon is just a smidgen smaller. And the nerd got the better of me, so I had to go in and really checked out about some of these cameras. And if you own a Nikon camera, it's not a 1.5 crop. It's somewhere between, let me get my numbers right, 1.52 and 1.55 crop. So it's a little bit higher than you might expect. And it kind of depends on, is it 23.5 or 23.6? Okay? Now, if you have a Canon, your 1.6 crop really isn't a 1.6 crop. It's going to range between 1.56 and 1.61. So Canons tend to be a little bit smaller, Nikons tend to be a little bit bigger, and they end up just being a fraction of a difference. And I know that there's been some people who's like, well, I'm going to get a Canon because it's a little bit bigger sensor, and we're talking 1/10 of a millimeter, which you're not going to notice in the long run. And for the rest of this discussion here, we're just going to combine them into one because they're so close, okay? And so we're just going to call that the APS sensor. Now, physical size, in comparison, these are size relative to each other. They're not actual size. Your sensor is not this big. But size relative is correct on here. And there's a couple different ways of figuring it. This is 225% of the size of this one, or this is 44% of the area of this one. So when it comes down to surface area, this is more than double the surface area. So it is quite a bit more real estate, you might say. The viewfinder. What you see in the viewfinder is very important, and it's going to be different between full frame and crop frame cameras. In this case, I'm going to compare a Canon 6D versus a 70D. They are pretty similar cameras, except for the fact that their sensor size is very different in size. And we're not going to get into the full implications of how they make their sensor sizes, but this uses what's called a 0.71, and what we do is we measure all the sizes and we multiply it by this factor. The smaller one uses a larger viewfinder, 0.95, but it's got a smaller size sensor, and so if we were to compare the two of them side by side or overlapped on each other, you do get, and it doesn't seem like 20% larger, but when you add in this area around the outside, you actually have 20% more viewable space. Think about a TV with 20% more real estate, right? Nice to have. All right, so the viewfinder experience in a full-frame camera is better than in a cropped frame camera. Next up, let's switch over to the Nikon brand, and let's compare a Nikon D610 versus the Nikon D7100, which once again are pretty similar cameras, except for the fact that the sensor size is different. Now, they have slightly different magnification ratios, and in this case, we're looking at a 0.7 versus 0.94, so if we compare these on top of each other, you will see that the 610, once again, in this case, has a 14% larger viewfinder. And so if you do a lot of looking through the viewfinder, like a lot of serious photographers do, you like that larger view because it's going to be easier for composition, for checking sharpness, and it's something you kind of get spoiled with. Once you get used to it, it's hard to go back down to that smaller frame sensor, which gives you that smaller viewfinder. All right, let's compare a Canon 5D Mark III and its focusing points and a Nikon D800, two really good cameras, against the Canon 70D and the Nikon D7100. Looking at the focusing point pattern, the question that I have is, how much area of the frame do those focusing points take up? And you can see how close to the edge the D7100 comes. If you need to focus on something, they have focusing points almost across the entire frame. This is fantastic here. This isn't so good. We've got a lot of blank area without any focusing points on it. So when it comes to sports photography, this is where APS has the advantage because they have focusing points that cover a greater percentage of the frame. Next comparison. Let's say you would like a wide-angle lens. All right? Might happen. Could happen to one of us. All right. These two lenses from Canon are similar in focal length. All right? Because 10 times 1.6, the crop factor, brings us back to the 16 equivalent of this lens. So you could buy full frame this lens, or you could buy crop frame that lens, and you're going to get very similar angle of view. I'm imagining a scenario where you want a Canon camera, and you said, I need a lens that sees 84 degrees from side to side. Just draw on a number so that we can have something to compare against. What are my options? How many different choices do I have? Well, if you buy a APS crop frame camera, you have a choice of two lenses. Now, there are some aftermarket ones that you could get, but within the Canon lineup, you only have two choices of lenses. If you decide to go with a full frame camera, we now have some serious choices. In this case, we have 6 different lenses that we can choose from, and they have all sorts of specialties: fixed lenses, zoom lenses, tilt-shift lenses. And so if you have really high demanding needs for wide-angle lenses, you're into real estate, architectural photography, you're going to probably want to have a full-frame camera because you have a lot of options to choose from. Let's try this with Nikon and see if Nikon is any better of a system. So we have our crop frame option. In this case, we need a 13 millimeter lens or wider, and Nikon is better. They make 3 lenses. Way to go, Nikon. And if you have a full frame camera, you're going to have, once again, 6 options. So a lot more options when you go with that full frame sensor. So it opens up possibilities when you're shooting wide angle. Now, let's do a telephoto check to see what happens when we go telephoto. I'm thinking about shooting sports photography. And in that, I know that you're going to need about a 7-degree angle of view, and it would be really nice if you had a lens that opened up to an aperture of 2.8. That way you could shoot in gymnasiums and low light situations. If I want to do that and I want to go full frame, well, that means I'm going to need a 300 millimeter 2.8 lens. That's the only way to get to 7 degrees and f2.8. Going to cost you just a shade under $10,000. Now, if I want to do this with a crop frame camera, well, I can do that with the Canon 7D, and instead of a 300, all I need is a 200 millimeter lens. And the price difference, it's somewhat noticeable as far as the price difference here. And the cameras are going to do not the same job, but they're going to collect the same amount of light, and they're going to have the same angle of view. And we could go into the arguments of why this one is better. We're not, because I could be here all day. But it's a similar type system doing similar type photography with a different size sensor. Okay, one more scenario here. Let's say you're going to buy a Nikon camera system. And you're thinking, maybe I'll go full frame, maybe I'll go crop frame. I'm not sure. Let me see how it plays out. Might choose between the D600 and the D7100, both very good cameras. With the 7100, let's say you want to get a couple of zoom lenses. The 16 to 85 and 70 to 300 would be a good package system with the 7100. $2,300. Now, one of the things that I recommend for people buying camera systems is that they buy appropriate lenses to the quality of their camera. And so if you get an upgrade camera, you should probably think about upgraded lenses so that everything is of matched quality. So we're going to have to look at maybe a little bit higher end lenses. In this case, a 24 to 120 and an 80 to 400. This is a better system, okay? There's no doubt, but it does come at a price. And so you have to really think about this when you're making that decision. Should I go crop frame or should I go full frame? And so some of the questions that you might ask yourself and answers to them are here. Should I buy a full frame camera? Here's what you need to think about. If you need a professional quality camera, they're making those in full frame. Lots of choices available there. If you need the absolute highest level of image resolution, you are going to want a full frame camera. That is where the cutting edge technology is these days. If you need really good low light performance, you're going to want a full frame camera. If your plan is to do wedding photography, you better have a full frame camera because your competition certainly does. If you need a good camera with bokeh, which is the out of focus area, you want that shallow depth of field, you're going to want a full frame camera because it's just easier to get, and in some cases you're just able to get it much, much better. If you have really demanding wide-angle needs, you're also going to want to be getting a full-frame camera, and APS is really not much of an option at all. So, what about buying an APS camera? I've made full-frame cameras seem pretty good. What about APS? If you need an easily affordable SLR, the value here is much better. You get a lot for the money. You can get into one of these systems relatively cheap these days. So, as I say, it's the biggest bang for the buck, in my opinion. If you need really good telephoto capabilities, these cameras kind of have a magnified telephoto built right in. So if you do a lot of sports photography, birding photography, wildlife photography, the crop frame cameras just have that inherent teleconverter advantage that is built into the smaller size sensor. So if you're new and you're spending less than $5,000, I really don't think you can do full frame properly. I don't think you can get the lenses and the support system in there. And so you do have to be pretty serious about investing in your system. If you're very serious in photography, chances are you're going to end up going full frame, and you might as well do it at the beginning so you don't have to sell your equipment and upgrade all your lenses and cameras. The serious enthusiast is probably going to want full frame, but there might be good reasons for the APS as well. If you're a working pro, chances are you're going to want a full frame camera, but there are chances that you could make good use of an APS camera as a backup camera or a second camera. And finally, the question that a lot of people have is, should I upgrade? I have this camera. Should I get the higher level camera? Is it going to make a difference for me? And for most people, the question really is do you have the dollars for the lenses? Do you have the money to afford all the extra higher end lenses that you're going to need? Because it's a serious question that needs to be addressed because it can cost quite a bit more. All right. I've totally forgotten what I'm going to talk about, but I'll figure it out here in a moment. All right, so I'm looking at another system here, and a full-frame system with one wide-angle zoom, one telephoto zoom, and a fast normal. What's this going to cost me to work with? In this case, it's going to cost you around $3,300. Let's compare that same system. I got 4.8 pounds there as well. Let's compare that with an APS system here. So Nikon D7100 with the same type of lenses that you would get if you kind of had that same agenda. And let's take a look at our prices here. How much are we going to spend? $2,360. Not that much difference. And our weight is going to be quite a bit less. And so if this does the job for you, The big difference here in my mind is that it's going to weigh you down less. It's going to be much less there. It's not that much more. So the money thing makes me go, well, just a little bit more. I'm getting a lot more here. And so it depends on what's important to you, money or weight. Let's compare this with a 4/3 system. Now this camera is really small, okay? And so it doesn't weigh much. Let's take a similar lens system, the same type lenses, similar type apertures. And if we take a look here, the money difference is hardly any difference. All right? So by going down to the 4/3 system, you're not saving much money, but look at the weight system. It's quite a bit less in weight. So if somebody was traveling by bicycle, talked about bicycle touring, you're going to see some photos of that coming up. If you're doing bicycle travel, you're thinking, I really need a lightweight. I'm going to do a backpacking trip. Then the 4/3 system really starts looking very, very good at that point. And so money and weight are big issues in this. So a lot of different ways of comparing these cameras back and forth. So let me check in and see what they're thinking on the questions.
Well, I just want to check in with you. Are we going to take a break after this segment, or do you still have another one to go?
We might want to take our break right here when we're done with our questions, just because we're pretty close to the break time.
Yeah, great. Okay, awesome.
Okay, so there are quite a few people in the chat rooms who are new to photography and new to all these concepts. So we are trying to, people in the chat rooms are also answering other people's questions, which is great. So this, I don't know if you want to get into this either, but Day1 Headlights said, so when I see a huge image wrapped around a building, like an Olympic banner or something, is that a sensor issue or is that a printing issue? Could I take and print that kind of image with my little D40? And Day1 Headlights says, I really want to know. Now, a lot of people have chimed in about this topic in the chat rooms, but I'm just wondering what's your 2 cents?
Yes, if you want to take your D40, which is a APS-C sensor, and you want to print it the size of the Olympic Stadium in Sochi, you could print it and cover the entire building. You could print it, okay, it'd be a little difficult, but you could print it and cover Russia with it if you wanted to. And from space, it might look just fine. But as you walked across it, you might have to jump pretty far between pixels. So it depends on the viewing distance is what really matters. You'd be surprised at how low of resolution billboards are. Billboards are not that hard to shoot. Nobody's within 100 feet of a billboard because they're up there, they're kind of far. So it really gets down to the viewing distance. How close are you going to be? And I know a lot of people like to go up to prints and they go, it's not sharp. Is that how you would normally view the print? No, let's put it back at a regular viewing distance. And so there is a relationship between image sensor size, number of pixels, and enlargement, but it depends on viewing distance and standards and so forth. So it can get a little complicated in there.
All right, this one is a review. I think for people who, like myself, it took me a little bit of time to kind of get my head around what is a megapixel. So this is a question from EG. Can you not compensate with higher pixel count on crop sensors? And then, as well as Amir Dora, do more megapixels mean better photo quality? If not, what are these megapixels anyway?
Pass. I will be talking more about pixels in the next section. Perfect. And I think it'll be better addressed there.
Perfect. All right, there is.
I do have a pass button over here. I don't know if you can see it, but I can skip any question I want.
Usually that's followed up with, there's a slide for that, or there's a section for that.
Any questions in the studio audience? You guys are learning, soaking this up? It's a lot, isn't it? It is a lot to take in.
Fantastic. All right, well, we are going to take our afternoon break, 15-minute break. John, let's talk about what the next section is.
Well, we're going to define what a megapixel is. We're going to talk specifically about the pixels, how they gather light.
Are you joking right now?
No, totally.
Clearly.
That's the plan. That's the plan, and I'm going to stick to it.
That was a transition question.
That was. Well, I'm glad. Now the pass makes so much more sense to me because I've never seen you pass a question.
It sounded like I was really brushing that person off, didn't it?
That's not possible. That doesn't happen here.
All right, well, we want to read out some of the folks that people are saying, John, in the chat rooms. Kieran M. says, I watched John Gringo about a year ago, and it drastically improved my photography. we feel the same way.
Yes, we do.
I had to come back this year because as the year has progressed, I realized that there were topics that I would love more clarification on. Thank you, Creative Live, for having John Gringo back. He is an amazing teacher. So thank you.
Oh, thank you.
And Creative Junkie says, I wish I had found Creative Live before I paid to go to school. I've learned more in this class than I did in my full quarter when I took fundamentals. John just has an easy and understandable way of teaching.
How cool is that?
Nice.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, I just want to say, address Karinam's comment about going back and learning this information over again. And I know you guys are probably overwhelmed with a lot of the information that is being taught just here in the first half of the first day, really. The cool thing about Creative Live, if you are new to Creative Live, is we do break down this course into segments. So, like they were saying, there are topics that you are able to soak in, and there's topics that you're not. So even if you're new to photography and a lot of this seems overwhelming, you can take it slowly, and when you get to that point, you can rewatch this. It might be 6 months down the line. It might be a year from now. You will always have this if you purchase it. And you can go back and watch the parts that are pertinent to you at that time. So that's what I really like about this course, how it is broken down into segments, and you can do that. So $149 if you purchase all 5 days of this course, which is a ridiculous amount of information. If you do purchase it while the course is live, while in the next 5 days, you can get it at a discounted price of $99. I can't say enough how invaluable this course was to me when I first started photography. It really changed my photography and brought it up to another level. And that is why I'm hosting here, because every time I watch this course, it does the same thing. So I think you guys should take advantage of the deal while you can. And with that, we're going to be back in 15 minutes, so we'll see you all shortly.
I'm learning to tell better stories. I'm learning how to manage
Welcome back, everyone, to Creative Live. We're just having a little fun over here during our break time, playing with these massive monster lenses. I'm a little bit worried. Glazers, you didn't see this. Anyway, folks, I did want to give Glazer's camera a shout out. What'd you say? There's like $100,000 worth of gear over there. Because Glazers, again, if you saw our little pre-show this morning with Susan and I, the reason I'm standing here today is from seeing a tweet from Glazer's camera, and that is how I found out about Creative Live, so they always hold a special place in my heart. But we love it when they can help us out, and they have done so for this class. When are we talking about lenses?
Tomorrow.
Tomorrow.
Yes.
So we'll be going through all of these and
exactly
when and why and.
You know, one of the things I'll mention, because a lot of Glazers is a Seattle establishment, and so there's a lot of people in other places. Well, Glazers doesn't do me any good because I don't live in Seattle.
Right.
And one of the things that they can do is that you can rent gear from them. They'll ship it to you. So if you needed something crazy like this and you didn't want to spend $20,000, but you needed it for a few days for, I don't know, surfing photography.
Right.
In Hawaii, you could rent it for a few days, have it shipped out, pick it up, use it, and then send it back.
Going on safari, can you rent internationally?
You can, yeah.
Yeah, so that's pretty amazing. Glazerscamera.com, and you can drop that in the chat rooms if you don't mind, Susan, and maybe their Twitter handle as well. But again, rentals, and then if you are in the area. And you've taught a lot of classes through Glazers as well, right?
I continue to teach down there at Glazers, and so I teach classes directly through there. So if you did want to take a class in person right there, I do teach classes, different versions of this class.
Okay.
And you can check my website out, which is johngringo.com as well, for more information about that.
johngringo.com. John Gringo, you talked about doing things in person with you. Yeah. And I just want to let everybody know again, a little teaser, on Wednesday, you and I are going to be making a big announcement
has something to do about being in person with you.
That's right.
That's
And
all
you
we'll
can,
give you.
Well, okay, not because of anything else.
Good,
That's
good.
it.
No.
We'll maybe some more tidbits tomorrow.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah.
All right, we're going to go put these back, but again, lenses tomorrow.
Careful.
Very delicately.
Careful.
All right. All right, thanks, John.
All right, thank you. All right, so we're going to continue talking about the sensor now, but now we're going to get into the actual pixels itself. So first off, what does pixel mean? What does it stand for? It's the picture element, okay? So that's where we get the word pixel. Now, your typical sensor is going to have a whole bunch of rows and a whole bunch of columns. There's a number of cameras out right now that have 24 megapixels or 24 million pixels, which means that it has 6,000 rows times 6,000 columns versus 4,000 rows. And that's where we get 24 million or 24 megapixels. Now, the pixels themselves are usually behind a little micro lens, which directs the light so that you get as much light in to that particular pixel as possible. Something that you may have noticed is that new cameras have more pixels than old cameras. And I don't know if we're still in it, but we've been having kind of a pixel race. Who can have the most pixels in their camera? And if the size of the sensor doesn't change, the way you get more pixels in there is by having them smaller and closer together. And the smaller pixels, well, those aren't as good as big pixels, and so there's a bit of a balance and trade-off. If you said, I want great image quality, we all say that, right? What do we need? Well, there's three things that we need. We need quantity. We need lots and lots of pixels. Okay, if nothing else mattered, just give me as many pixels as I can possibly get. But that isn't the only factor. The other one is the size of the pixels. This is a little stat that you're going to find very, very buried, and the specific number doesn't really matter right now. But the size of the pixels, the bigger they are, the better they're going to be able to work with low light levels. Quality of pixels. All right, what's the quality of pixel? That's basically how new your camera is. How good a processor and system did they actually use for this little device to pick up light? New cameras tend to be much better than older cameras, and so you might find two cameras that both have 16 megapixels, but one does a much better job. And it's just because it has newer technology. And that's the way that technology works. So, when we think about pixels, it might be easy to start off with a scenario of 4 pixels. Okay, imagine the very first camera, which had 4 pixels. I'm totally making this up, but just kind of play along, all right? Just imagine a camera with 4 pixels, and you said, okay, well, that's all well and good, but I would like more resolution. And so you invent the first 9-pixel camera, okay? So you went from 4 to 9. How much better is 9 versus 4? It's clearly better, okay? There's no dispute there. It depends on how we want to compare it. So if we go from 4 to 9, that's a 125% increase. We started with 4, and we've added 5 to it. So that's the 125%. Another way to think about it is that we've gone from 2 lines of resolution to 3 lines of resolution, which isn't that big a difference. And so this is the way I would refer to it if I was trying to sell you a camera. This camera is 125% better than this one. But if I'm actually printing photographs, and we had a question about printing, I need to be thinking about how many lines of resolution I have. And the reality for printing is this is 1/3 better than that. It's not that big. It's better, but not that much better. So I like to do a lot of testing, and I like to do comparing between different cameras. So we're going to compare, in this instance, a 6-megapixel crop frame camera versus an 18 crop, a 22 full frame, and the top-of-the-line 36-megapixel camera. So before we look at these results, I want you to just build in your mind what you think the difference is between 6 and 36. And so what we're going to do to get a reasonable comparison is we got to enlarge a very small section. Let me stand out of the way. And you can see the difference, and without a doubt, the images get sharper as you go from left to right. Now, how much of a difference is there in the sharpness? Can you not read the letters? No, the letters are just sharper in their clarity and in their edge detail. And so more pixels do help. For the most part, you're going to be able to get very good quality images from 6 megapixels on up the scale from there. We did have to blow this up very large to get any real significant difference between them. Now, on the sensor itself, if we can imagine all these pixels that we would have, and these are the micro lenses over all the pixels, a good analogy for understanding how the pixels work is imagine the pixels as buckets of light collecting rainwater. Okay? So in this first case, we have a bunch of light coming in, and we're going to get our bucket. There we go. And we're going to fill our bucket with light. All right? When we fill that bucket all the way up, the camera knows that it's a white pixel because the bucket is completely filled up. The sensor is fully exposed to light. In the next scenario, we'll imagine a smaller amount of light coming in, and it fills up the bucket about halfway. And that is going to be a gray pixel. And we're forgetting about color. Just think about white to black. And so the bucket's half full. That's going to be a gray pixel. The next bucket is just going to have a little bit of light coming in it, a little bit of rain coming in, and we get a dark pixel because that pixel doesn't have very much information in it. That bucket doesn't have very much light in it, very much rain in it in this case. All right, next scenario. You point your camera directly at the sun. Okay? A lot of light. Our cup runneth over. Okay? What happens with that extra light? Nothing. It's clipped. We don't capture it. What's whiter than white? There isn't anything. It's just white. And so we've lost this extra information up here, and so we don't get anything out of it. Now, one of the things that we can do is, let's take this and fill it halfway, is how do we know this is gray? Well, because we know where the top of the bucket is. All right? Well, one of the things we can do is we can lie to our camera and say, that's not the top of the bucket. Pretend this is the top of the bucket. And this is kind of like the old TV sets. You guys remember the TV sets that had the brightness knob? You could just turn the brightness up on it and make it brighter. Did it make it brighter in the studio or out where they were filming on location? No, it just made your screen brighter. And that's kind of what we're doing. And it's changing ISO for those of you who know what I'm talking about. All right, so let's take these remaining 4 buckets. And what we're going to do is going to put in just a little bit of light in each one of these. So it's pretty dark. They're all the same. And what we're going to do in this is we're going to falsify our levels here, and we're going to pretend that this is the top. So what we're doing is we're turning up the brightness on all these sensors. And in theory, they should all be exactly the same. Now, the problem with this is that in our sensor, there is all these electronics running back and forth, because it's all hooked up electronically. And there's a little bit of heat that is generated by this. And there's a little bit of an issue. And it's kind of like in the buckets of water, imagine a layer of scum at the bottom. Don't you love my analogies? Okay, so imagine you had to drink water from a bucket that had a scum layer on the bottom. Would you go for a bucket that was a real big bucket of water or just a little bit of water there, down there at the bottom? This is the signal-to-noise ratio. How much signal versus how much noise. And we like having a lot of signal and not much noise. And over here, we don't have much signal, and the ratio of noise is pretty high. And what that means is that in here, it's not getting a very clean signal. And so if we decide to compare these pixels, which should be identical, they're going to vary a little bit. And this manifests itself in noise. And this is a dark area of a photograph where the pixels really aren't sure what to do, and they've got a little bit of heat and electronics running through them, and you get this unclean signal from it. And that's the noise problem when we try to crank up our ISOs too far, and that's why we try to avoid that as much as possible. Now, another factor beyond this turning up the volume, you might say, is the actual pixel size. Now, kind of the reigning champion on the market for resolution and sharpness is the Nikon D800 camera. It's got 36 megapixels. However, it's not the highest megapixel camera you can buy these days, because that actually goes to Nokia and their Lumia phone with 41 megapixels. So what's better, 36 or 41? Well, I said before that more pixels are better, all things being equal, but all things are not equal here. The D800 is using a full-frame sensor, 43 millimeter sensor, corner to corner measured. This is using a little 2/3 sensor that's only 11 millimeters. If you could actually scope out and get in close enough, you would see the size of the sensor in this case. This is measured in micrometers, 4.8 micrometers, versus 1.12. That's the size of the sensor, and if you want to see the relative size difference, and yes, I have done the math to get the relative size difference down to the pixel level. That's the difference in size difference between a phone, a very, very good phone camera versus a very good still camera. Which one of these two do you think absorbs light better? Think of it as a solar array. The bigger the pixel, the much better it's going to do under low light. And so a big thing is having a big pixel in the camera. So what does this look like when it comes to image quality and low light ability? So I took some cameras, I set them up to ISO 1600, and I took a wide variety of cameras from a point-and-shoot camera all the way up to the full-frame 36-megapixel camera. And as you can see, these full frames look nice and clean at 1600. But as we get to the smaller size sensors, especially all the way down here to the point-and-shoot, we're getting very, very noisy images. If we just ratchet it up a bit to ISO 3200, you can see that it's just getting noisier and noisier. And so how high of ISO can you shoot with depends on, a little bit, your sensor size. There's some other factors, but that's a good portion of it. Now, what does this look like in the real world? Well, here's an example of two different photographs. One of these images was shot with a digital SLR, about $3,000 or $4,000 setup. One of them was shot with a point-and-shoot camera of about $500. Can you see the difference between $3,000 and $500? Maybe not, but if we blow up a small common portion, I bet you're going to be able to tell pretty easily when you start getting into the details. The full-frame sensor is going to handle the highlights much better. Just looking at the details in the sky and down here in the windows, just not going to get that information on those little tiny pixels. Doesn't hold it nearly as well. If you're only producing very small images, you're not going to see much difference. And so that's how sometimes very simple basic cameras can take really good pictures. If you really get in to look at the details, you'll notice that there's some shortcomings in there. Now, I had a collection of cameras at my house. I was borrowing some. I had some of my own. And I'm like, okay, this is a good time to run a test because I got all these different cameras out here. And I'm comparing some 4/3 cameras, some cropped cameras, a couple of full-frame cameras, including the new Nikon DF, which is a very interesting camera because it's a full-frame sensor, but it's the first time Nikon has kind of come down in the number of pixels that they put in there. Rather than 24 or 36 megapixels, they only put in 16 megapixels, 16 million pixels. And let's take a look and see if that pays off under low light conditions. So first off, at ISO 200, things are looking pretty good. Even down here with the smallest sensor. Pretty good quality. Let's raise this up to a little higher level. ISO 6400. This would be very low light. This is the highest level that all of them can get to. Look at how clean the Nikon DF is. The Nikon DF is just fantastic in low light. And I think it has been crowned the king of low light right now. And as we get to the smaller size sensors, just not doing as well under really low light conditions. And so once you get to know what you're shooting, if you were, say, shooting horse jumping, which is always taking place indoors in kind of dark arenas, this equipment's going to be very hard to use if you need to shoot at ISO 6400. So there's a number of factors involved, and so the full-frame sensors do much better at those low lights. But if you remember back at the ISO 200, there wasn't that big a difference. So if somebody doing travel photography under good light, the smaller framed cameras could do quite well. Now, something else this is a new thing for this class, the pixel pattern. There's some options on pixel patterns, the type of sensors that go in cameras. Now, the standard system that is in most cameras is a little surprising to those this is new to, and this is the way the pixels look on your camera. Each pixel does not record red, green, or blue. It records red, or green, or blue. And as you can see by the pattern here, there are twice as many green as there are any other color, and it's because our eyes are more sensitive to green than any other color. And so this is the highly magnified view of your sensor, okay? And you might notice that if you had a red line, you could very easily make a horizontal red because there's lots of red pixels that go right in a row, or a vertical line, or a 45-degree line. But if you were trying to draw a different line, it would kind of get a little jagged and not do real well. And we have a bit of a problem in this called moire. And I can do some very, very fun, look at this, things with moire. All right, so when we have these lines that aren't quite lined up, but you move them around, you can cause some very, very weird patterns. And if you've ever seen a newscaster wear the wrong type of tie on TV, it kind of burns up and becomes a flame. And so to avoid this problem, modern cameras, for the most part, use something called an AA filter. It's an anti-aliasing filter, also known as an optical low-pass filter. And what's happening is that in your camera is an image sensor. It actually has an infrared filter in front of it. And then what they do is they add in the AA filter, which actually comes in two parts. There's a horizontal and a vertical separation. So what happens is light travels through the AA filter, it splits, goes through the IR filter, and that's where the IR filter gets its work done, and then it splits it again, first time for horizontal, second time for vertical, and so it takes 1 point of light and it splits it into 4 areas so that it kind of summarizes, it blurs the scene ever so slightly. And so we are actually intentionally blurring things so that we don't have this burning up anti-aliasing problem, a moire problem. Okay, so what a few cameras have done is they've taken out the AA filter. And it's not quite right to say it's taken out the AA filter, but they've kind of reversed its effects. And so what happens on these is the light will go through, it'll split, go through the IR filter, and then it brings the light back together. So rather than splitting it off into 4, it brings it into 2, and then 2 back into 1. Now, there is a possibility of getting moire when you have this, but if you have a high enough level of megapixels, you don't need to worry about it. The reason we have the moire problem is that we don't have quite enough pixels. If you have enough, it's not an issue. And so this is not a complete list, but this is a list of some cameras that do not have AA filters, or they have an option of not having the AA filter. Nikon's been very big on this bandwagon of taking it off. They took it off in the D800E. They left it on in the D800. But in a lot of their lower-end cameras, like the D33 and the 5300 and the new 7100, they've taken off the AA filter, even on one of their little point-and-shoots. Pentax has either taken it off or they have put on an option where it can be turned on or off through a system that we don't have time to go into right now, but they are attacking the issue as well. And Sony is doing it as well. Their models that end with the letter R are the ones that do not have the AA filter in it, so anyone who wants really high resolution can do that there as well. And the new Olympus OMD mirrorless camera does that as well. And this is something we're seeing more and more of. And the reason they're doing this is to get sharper pictures. And the theory is that by taking off the AA filter, you will get sharper pictures. The theory is correct, and it does work in reality, but it's by a very small margin. You have to really get in and get extraordinarily nerdy to see the difference. But there is a difference. Now, beyond that, there are a couple of other systems. Not real popular. Sigma has developed, in theory, which looks like the ultimate system. It works like film, where light will travel through different layers, and it will record whether it's blue, green, or red, which is kind of nice because then we get away from that bearer pattern. Fuji has done something very innovative, I think, tapping their history in film, and what they've done is they've created a more random pattern so that we don't have these moire problems. And they have put this into not quite all, but many of their cameras. And so one of the reasons that the Fuji cameras are popular, one of the reasons I like them, is that they have really good sharpness to them for the size of the sensor and the number of megapixels. And part of that is due to their very innovative design of their sensor. And just not having that AA filter, being able to get cleaner light to their pixels. So there's a lot of interesting stuff going on in this field. Let me check back in with Susan and Kenna now to see how we're doing and what sort of questions we might have.
We're doing great, John. You know, it's hard to do this because every time you mention it. Oh, it's on, actually. Go ahead, Kenna.
Oh, okay. I don't know exactly what you were going to say because usually I can read your mind, however. I'm trying hard. Probably that there's always a slide for that. Is that what you're going to say? And so a lot of questions come in, and they are for further sections that we know that there are slides for that.
All right. Is my mic on now? All right. This is what I was going to say, John.
Okay.
Was that, you know, when you talk about ISO, just mentioning it in one slide, then all the questions come in about ISO.
Right.
So it's hard to keep them all. And I'm not sure if you want to get into a question about ISO or Should we wait for the segment?
Well, it's the next segment.
All right, let's do that. Let's wait. And
Yeah.
I just want to say I really appreciate everyone asking their great questions, and we will get to them all. So if we don't ask your question right when you ask it, it is because we have a full segment on that.
You know it's coming.
Right?
Yeah.
Any questions in our in-studio audience?
Sensor sizes, things like that.
All right, I think we should keep
Okay.
going.
I don't get much rest.
Sorry,
It's
John.
true. I mean, like I said, I can ask you some questions, but you'd still have to answer them, so it's really not rest either way.
All right, so let's talk about ISO. And so ISO, we've been kind of alluding about it, but now we're finally here. And so first off, let's do the basic. Let's define what ISO stands for. ISO is a standard that is kept by all the manufacturers, so that if you have ISO in Canon or Nikon or Pentax or Fuji, it's going to be the exact same number. So if you were to be out shooting with your friends and everyone shot with a different camera and you said, hey, these are the correct settings, you could all set the same settings and get the same result as far as exposure value. So it's just a standard that we all keep. Now, the standard for most cameras is ISO 100. ISO 100 is a very convenient number. It allows us to work under bright light with many different types of lenses. But 100 is kind of the base number for most cameras. Some cameras, the base number is 200. But we're just going to talk as if 100 is the base number for most cameras right now. Now, at ISO 200, if you go from 100 to 200, your camera then becomes, in some words, twice as sensitive to light. If you make no other change in your camera, your picture will be twice as bright. Now, what's really happening is that your camera is getting in half as much light, and it's cranking up the brightness by 2. Okay, that's what's kind of going on behind the scenes, is it's just turning up the brightness by 2. We can go up to 400, and it's 4 times as sensitive as it is at 100, so it would be 4 times brighter. Now, we can just keep going up this ISO scale till our cameras top out. Now, many cameras are going to top out around 6400. Many modern cameras are going to go a bit beyond that. And so this is the range that we're typically going to play in when we're adjusting our ISOs. A number of cameras out there, like 3, will go all the way up to 200,000. Very high ISO, that is for sure. So, as you've been able to probably gather by this point, if you want optimum image quality, you want a low number. And if you need high sensitivity, that would be a very high number. Now, if you go from 400 to 800, you've doubled the sensitivity, you've doubled the amount of light. This is also, going back to our old terms, a full stop of light. So we've increased by a full stop. If we go back down to 200, we've cut the sensitivity in half, down to half the sensitivity, because we've doubled the number and we cut the number in half. So it's really easy math because you're just double, half, double, half. Now, a lot of your cameras, if you have an intermediate level or higher, you'll be able to set these third stops in between. A lot of the entry-level cameras don't allow you to go in the third stops, and that is not a big deal. Don't worry about it. A lot of the entry-level Nikons and Canons just do these steps here. They don't do the third stops. It's not a big deal at all. Don't worry about it. Every once in a while, you do want to get really picky with it, so it can be nice to have. Now, on some cameras, many cameras these days, they will often have either a low setting or more frequently a high setting up here. And what's going on in this case is you are kind of going beyond the recommended settings. In many of the low cases, what's happening is the camera is getting in the exact same amount of light as ISO 100, and the camera is, in software, making it darker by 1 stop. And that's the same thing that's going on at high ISOs. The camera is doing the exact same thing as it is at 6400, but it's just making it brighter, with more software than hardware to do that. And so it's kind of pushing beyond its normal limits, and it's kind of a warning that you're going outside the normal standards. Now there is auto ISO as well. So auto ISO automatically switches the ISO according to what it thinks you need. And the main parameter in choosing which ISO you should have is the fact that the camera is looking at your shutter speed. And it's looking, what shutter speed are you at, and is that appropriate for hand holding the camera? Okay, that's kind of nice of it, but what if I'm on a tripod? Then it doesn't work out so well. All right? And so you're probably not taking this class to learn how to use auto ISO. This is kind of like automatic drive in a race car. Do you think a serious race car driver would want automatic drive in their car? Not a chance. Not a chance at all. They want to be able to have specific control where they have their camera set. And that's what you're going to want, controlling your camera. And so we're going to want to control this ourselves, not have the camera do it. All right. Let's see the problem with shooting at different ISOs, because we've talked about the noise and we've kind of seen some sneak previews of it. But in this example, I'm going to show you, it's going to be a little hard to tell the difference in the top row, because the size of the screen and the fact that most cameras are really good up to ISO 800. So this is just one particular camera. And if we just jump on all the way up here to the top, obviously this is pretty bad, right? The ISO 25,000, not looking too good. What my general rule of thumb is figure out what ISOs your camera will go to. Okay? Sometimes it'll say 6400, but you have high 1, which means you can really go up to 12,800. The highest setting in your camera is most likely complete garbage. Okay? You don't want to use it if you need good quality. The next highest setting in your camera is also complete garbage. Okay? The next one is probably going to be the highest level that you're going to want to use. All right? I've had some people in my classes that have older cameras that top out at ISO 800. Well, in their case, 800's bad, 400's bad. They can only use 1 and 200. All right? And this is where we've gotten much, much better in the last several years, because now, with a good camera, you could shoot up at ISO 6400, and some people would never know that it was set that high because the images are so clean. So let's take a walk through a bunch of images, and I will kind of explain my philosophy in choosing ISOs for them. So in this case, we're doing landscape photography. My subject is not moving, so I can use a tripod. I can use any shutter speed I want, and I'm going to want to choose the lowest ISO possible because I want the greatest detail, so that if I make a really big enlargement and I go in and look at the details, it's nice, clean information in that image. So landscape photography, ISO 100, that's for sure. Now, I'm going to shoot some action. I'm not on a tripod anymore, and I got stuff moving around in frame. Do I bump the ISO up? Well, I take a look at my shutter speeds. Are they appropriate for the action that I'm shooting? If it's okay, then I'm going to try to stick at ISO 100. A lot of people think, oh, it's getting really dark out. Maybe I should bump up the ISO. Well, not necessarily so. If my subjects are not moving, and I'm not moving, and my camera's on a tripod, I can shoot at any shutter speed I want. I'm going to try to keep this at ISO 100 so that if I make an enlargement, I have clean, sharp, detailed information with no or very little noise. So do I ever switch out of ISO 100? Of course. ISO 200 almost immediately gets set on my camera every time I go out on the water in a boat, because then I no longer have control of my movement to some degree. I can't use a tripod, and the boats are always moving around a little bit. And so whenever I'm out in a kayak or a rowboat or even any type of boat, I'm going to use something a little bit higher. In this case, I'm choosing ISO 200 partially because I need depth of field. And I know we haven't talked about that yet, but I needed to close the aperture down, and I needed a little bit faster shutter speed to be able to handhold the camera. And so we'll talk more about that later on. ISO 200. Now this is what I shot with Kenna and Susan.
That does look familiar.
When I was out in the bus, I brought my tripod on the bus, but I realized that as people moved on and off the bus, the whole bus moved. And it doesn't do any good to shoot with the tripod on there because it's a moving platform. And so I had to compensate with a little bit faster shutter speed, which means I had to bump up my ISO to 200. Whenever I shoot sports, even if they're outdoors, I almost always have to go to ISO 400 or faster, because I need really fast shutter speeds to stop their action. And so that's just kind of the starting point for sports photography, unless you have really, really good light. All right, my subject's not moving very fast here, but I'm on the back of an elephant, and if you've ever ridden an elephant, they don't stand still. They are constantly shifting their weight around. And so I got to compensate for my movement, which is exaggerated in this case. I'm in a fairly dark inside area with these birds, and they're moving around. I'm moving around a little bit. ISO 800, and if we do an enlargement here, we're still getting very good, clean detail at ISO 800, at least on the camera that I shot this with. ISO 800, after sunset, shooting action. Getting much darker at ISO 1600. I know I'm getting some movement in here, and I'm okay with some, but this is where when we start enlarging a section of it, you're going to start seeing that the information is not as clean. It's getting a little bit rougher. It's kind of like that grainy look on film. But in this case, it's noise. ISO 1600, outside in a very, very dark forest. ISO 3200, if you ever go into a nightclub, it's terrible lighting. Yeah, they've got some lights on the band, but it looks terrible from a photographic standpoint and how much. And you'll notice in here, now we're getting really grainy in here. But that's what I had to do in order to get a shutter speed to stop his motion. Low light, fast action, needed that faster, higher speed ISO at 3200. 6400, very low light conditions, very near sunset in a fairly dark forest. If we enlarge the beak on this, you're going to see here, this is getting really noisy right in here. If it's small, you kind of don't even notice it. 6400, for obvious reasons, very dark out. And if we blow up a section of this, you're going to see some very heavy noise. Look at this noise in here. All right? Doesn't look great, but probably wasn't the first thing you thought about when you saw the image. Now, you can go up beyond 6400 on many of the newer cameras. I was shooting a friend's band, and they were lit by like one 60-watt bulb. It was just horrible. And if you look at a portion of this, this is where you get this really bad noise. It gets very, very heavy. Very rarely will I ever go up here. It's more just kind of for experimentation. There's Barry. It's the one cat photo in the whole place. Sorry about it. And so it's not real smooth. I mean, it's not whisker sharp here, okay? Can you go beyond it? How about 25,000? So I shot this down at Yosemite. I was coming back late at night, and it was just a little bit of light left, and we got these shots, but I had to go up to 25,000 to get the shots. And this is shot with RAW. And what I did is show you a little blow-up portion here. This is the original RAW, and one of the things you can do is you can use software to add a little bit of noise reduction. And what it does is it just kind of softens the picture a little bit, so it softens the edge on the noise problem. Now, some cameras have built-in processors for processing this noise, but I prefer to do it later because you have much finer-tuned control depending on the type of subject that you shoot. And so this is something that I would much prefer to do later. When I do my camera classes, I tell most of my advanced users to turn that off so that you can deal with it manually later on. So there's a lot of different ISOs you can shoot at. And with modern programs like Lightroom, I can get extraordinarily nerdy again. And I can check out what percentage of my pictures I take at different ISOs. And so about 60% of the time, I'm shooting at ISO 100. Now, I shoot a wide variety of stuff. I don't just shoot one thing. I love travel photography and landscape. I do some sports, a little bit of portrait here and there. But you can see primarily most of the stuff I shoot is between 1 and 400. And very rarely, and it's extraordinarily rare, that I'll go beyond 3200. So once again, here's our list of, these are the typical ISOs that you're going to be dealing with. And when it comes to ISOs, it's only technical as to why you're going to choose something. You're going to choose the lowest setting for optimum quality, and if you need it, you're going to choose a higher number for higher sensitivity. Now, my guidelines on how to set your ISOs are pretty simple. Number one, the goal is just to keep the ISO as low as possible. Number two, you're going to raise the ISO for one of two possible reasons. Reason A, which is 99% of the time, you need a faster shutter speed. And every once in a while, you might need more depth of field, and you might have to adjust your ISO for that. But most of the time, you have your eye on the shutter speed, and you're checking to see if it's appropriate for that situation. And if you need a faster shutter speed, you bump up the ISO so that you can get that faster shutter speed. So, this is a good time to pause and see how we're doing for questions.
Well, Dina had a question in the
Excellent.
studio audience.
I think it was the lion and also the wolf at Yosemite. Were those taken? Did you have your camera on a tripod when you took those? You were up to 12,000.
They were not on a tripod because the animals move around. It's very hard to do tripod shots with animals.
And get the, yeah.
Yeah, and so I was balancing it on the top of a car, and I was trying to do the best to use the slowest shutter speed possible. And you might say my back was up against the wall because I believe I was shooting with a 300 millimeter lens at around 1/15 of a second, which is pretty. It had a couple stops of stabilization. And I'm pretty good at holding it steady, and so I did get some blurry shots in there. And so the only thing left to do was just to keep raising that ISO until I got the right amount of light in.
Amazing. Thank you.
Sure.
So, John, the question that had come up earlier, this is from Photographic Elements. They'd like to talk about what is the technical explanation of why ISO 160 is sharper than 100 and why multiples of 160 are sharper. And also then goes on to say why 125, 250, 500, and 1,000 have the most grain, which I don't know anything about that part. But
well, it's still a little bit of a disputable fact, and it kind of depends on which camera they're on. My theory, because I don't know that I know the right answer, so I'll call it a theory, is that imagine, and I think they're probably talking about Canon, but I'm just going to say it. Imagine Canon, the sensor development team, they came out with the sensor and they go, okay, here's the sensor and it's great. And then the camera team came in and they said, well, it's 160. And we like 100 to be the standard number. And they go, well, I'm sorry, the sensor is 160. And they go, maybe can you just dial it down in software? I know you want it 160, but just dial it down by 2/3 of a stop. No one will notice. I think that's what happened, but people noticed. And so I think that might be the true native sensitivity. And they've just kind of dialed it back because for convenience factor, 100 is a very convenient ISO to have. And so that may be the case. At least that's my best working theory.
All right. Thank you. Question from Kelly Trimble in Branson, Montana, or Kelly Trimble Branson. Can you tell us anything about ISO versus ASA? And Wolfie Wolf said the same thing.
Sure.
Why did it go from ASA to ISO? What's the difference is there?
Well, ISO stands for International Organization Standard. ASA stands for American Standards Association. And why, I guess the question that I don't know is why did they develop ASA if there was an ISO, or why did they develop ISO? And it could be some sort of U.S. versus the world combativeness. My guess is that, I don't know, maybe the ASA came around first and then Europe said, well, let's not do the American standard. Let's do an international standard. And they somehow picked the exact same numbers to work with. Because there is a third one called DIN, D-I-N, and that is a completely different set of numbers. And if anyone has an old film box, they would see that it has an ASA setting and a DIN setting. But you don't see those DINs anymore. So luckily, it's all simplified at ISO now.
All right, so I'm not sure if you want to get into the conversation that we talked about a little bit when you said if you owned a sports car, would you get an automatic?
Right.
So there's always exceptions to every rule.
That's right.
And Tough Toodle said, since watching your last class, I have tried very hard to shoot manually. But my most frequent subject is my 2.5-year-old daughter, who is quick. I often shoot her outside in changing light conditions and find that I can't adjust my settings quick enough to keep up with her. Are there certain situations where you do recommend using auto ISO or one of the other autos?
Yeah, right. So I'm listening very closely, and I'm trying to figure out what's the catch thing right there. And so what would a professional do in that situation is they would not allow the kids to play in lighting situations that vary. All right? They would set up the playpen in a shaded area or in the sun. They wouldn't allow them to go back and forth. And so you have to play a game of don't touch the sunshine. And so if you could control their working area, you would simplify things. And that's what professionals would seriously do, is they're trying to narrow down the parameters. I felt really sorry there was a big football game 2 days ago, and it was played in a stadium that was partly in sun and partly in shadows. Because it's very hard to make that change for the video or the still shooters as they go back and forth. And so the first thing is just try to control your environment. Yes, there are situations where auto ISO would work. The scenario that I hear from time to time is with bird photographers, and they're photographing birds which they don't have control over. Not that you have a lot of control with kids either, but even less control with birds. And the birds are flying around from in trees to in the shade and so forth. They would set a particular shutter speed that they wanted, maybe even an aperture they wanted, and then they would let the camera choose the ISO. All right. So very rare, let's see, let me restate this. In this class, I'm going to have a lot of rules of thumb, just kind of general settings. Don't do this, do this, and break all of them. That's totally fine. All right. Anytime you do something, there's a good reason to do exactly the opposite. And so there's very few never, ever, ever do this type things. I mean, it's an art world that we're dealing in, and there's a lot of different options we can get. And so this is just one of those. So I want to get people off of ISO. It's kind of like a drug. I would like to get you off of auto ISO, get you in control of your photography life, understand what you're doing, and then occasionally use it if necessary in that situation.
Well, maybe just unless there's more questions in the studio. Yes, Dina.
The beauty of that is having enough information to make that decision for a reason.
That's right.
You're not going auto because you don't know what to do. You're choosing it because you know what the other options are, but this is the best for the situation. So that's the beauty of this workshop.
Well stated.
Exactly. Thank you, Dina. I guess I was just going to kind of round it out and say this question from photo counselor / comment. So in reference to the other comments that people were making about movement in relation to ISO, are you making that connection because of the decision-making process involved in choosing ISO in relation to shutter speed and aperture? And am I correct in saying that movement and ISO are not directly related, or that you have to look at it in the whole picture?
That's a very complicated question. I think that will become much more clear when we get through the exposure section.
I agree.
But I think one thing I can address on that is that there's more than two, but at least two. Today we've been talking about shutter speeds, and we've been talking about ISOs. Now, which one is more important? Okay, because at some point you're going to have to make a decision as to, well, do I do it right here and wrong here, or the other way around? And in general, you remember my hell shot? The slightly blurry water shot? Okay, you remember the runner that was slightly blurry? Those are unacceptable. There is a level of complete unacceptability when it comes to focus. If you do not get sharp enough picture, it doesn't matter how fine your grain is. It's not worth it. And so when you come down to that decision making, shutter speed almost always wins out. If you need the shutter speed, you take it. You go for it. You end up with that higher ISO, but it's better to have a slightly grainy picture than a slightly blurry picture.
All right. Should we do one more before we get people off the ISO?
Sure.
All right. So, THP Studios said, what is your view on the ISO assist feature, where camera adjusts ISO automatically to changing light conditions while maintaining shutter and aperture settings? Is it a good feature on Nikon and Canon?
Well, this is kind of the same ISO question that we've been going on. And in general, I try to limit that use. One of the things that kind of did spur up in my mind is that on a lot of the newer cameras, you can set your camera to auto ISO, but you can start giving it some guidelines. So don't go above this. Don't go below this. If this, always let me have this shutter speed, or, watch out, I need to maintain a certain shutter speed. And so it's become much more customizable, but you do need to know how to get into your camera to customize it. And so there's sports photographers who had said, don't let me go below 500th of a second. And if they go below 500th of a second, it raises the ISO so that they get that fast shutter speed that we were just talking about. And so it's typically going to be used in action photography. Sports, wildlife are going to be the main places that people would use auto ISO to its best advantage. And if you have that customized feature, familiarize yourself and learn how to get in there and where to set it for your type of photography.
All right, I think we can move along.
Well, we're basically wrapping up now.
Oh.
We're going to wrap up for the day. I mean, the sensor section isn't that completely long. I will kind of just throw in here, once again, if you are interested in learning how to customize the ISO on your camera. I do have a lot of classes on particular camera. So if you see your camera up here, I have a class, or I will have a class. I have some classes coming up in mid-February that I'm going to get on the books. It's going to be kind of mirrorless madness on all of those days. And once again, if you didn't see it before, I do have a travel photography class here at Creative Live. You can go onto Creative Live's website, type in travel, and you should be able to find it pretty easily. But it's going to be a great class for anyone who likes to travel, how to plan, set up their trip. And that's that. So.
All right. Well, John, before we talk about tomorrow, I did want to talk about the learning projects that you have put together. Our students here have all of them in front of them. But John has put together some wonderful things to go out and utilize what you are learning here today and actually trying out. So this is included when you do purchase Anytime access to the class. It's a download, a PDF that's up there on the site right now if you have already purchased. So talk about this and why you put this together.
Well, this is homework, and I hate homework, and that's why I called it a learning project. It's for you to learn photography and you to learn your particular camera. It's not the most exciting stuff, but it's a good chance for you to just get out there, no stress on getting the shot, practice getting the shot for a number of different things. We're going to have tests in there for how to handhold the camera. So you can try it with different lenses or stabilization turned on and off. How steady, how slow a shutter speed can you hold a camera? I know because I've done the test. All right. What ISO are you going to determine is the highest ISO that you want to use on your camera? I know because I've done the homework assignment. And there's a variety of other tests in there that basically test your camera out here, 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 here. And then you download them, you look at the picture results, and then you can really see how good your camera is and where you want to draw the line. Because I can't just come up here and say, don't shoot anything over ISO 3200. That depends on your personal needs and standards, and it depends on the camera and sensor that you have. And so you need to know the equipment you're working with. By walking through this, you're going to know your equipment better, and you're going to be able to make better decisions when you're out shooting pictures.
Great. All right. Well, it's always good to have a workbook at your side. So let's talk about what we're going to do tomorrow, John.
Tomorrow's going to be a big day. Tomorrow might be the big day. We're going to be going through the lens, and that might be the longest section in the class. Warning to all the crew members, that's going to be a long section, so hit the restrooms and have little snack breaks there for you. Because we're going to be going through all these lenses over here, and we're going to be talking about focal lengths and apertures and depth of field. And, I might need to bring in a tilt shift lens over here and a fisheye lens because we're going to be talking about tilt shift and fisheye over here, which, as I say, not everyone's going to use, but is fun to have. And that's the first part. Then the second part of it is going to be dealing with exposure. And this is where we really bring home the whole shutter speed, aperture, and then tomorrow's discussion, shutter speed, ISO, tomorrow's discussion, aperture, into one section. And we're going to be playing a game with prizes, very small prizes, not that big, and for how well you can judge which ISO, what shutter speed you should choose for a variety of situations. So it's going to be fun.
All right. Well, I thought this was a big day, but I guess it was a small day compared
to tomorrow.
Start. Okay, good start. Speaking of a good start.
Get a warm-up
I know,
for everyone.
Seriously. Franklin K. said, just want to comment, so far this class is exactly what I was hoping to learn. Great start, John. Rogers Global said he's really amazing. I've yet to have an instructor I've yet to have an instructor teach me anything more.
Sorry.
After you, go ahead.
No, finish.
Okay. What's better is that each time I see this course, it gets better, and so do I. I thought that was cool.
I thought you were done, and I was going to chime in and say that I believe that is Melissa's husband, Jared, who has been here a number of times and has traveled with John. Sorry about that. I thought you were done.
No problem. Jared had more to say. All right, and one more. This is from TRT Helen. You have no idea how much this is helping me, and John is phenomenal. I am really getting so much already from this class. He explains things simply but in depth, and I think that has been the resounding message from people, that you're so clear. You have a way of just clearly putting it out there and people understand.
Well, good.
Not to
mention what I was hoping for. That's the intention.
Not to mention your intense keynote.
Yes.
That is extremely thorough.
Yeah, I mean, I think we talk about ourselves as photographers, and if you really want to master it, you have to learn and then go out and do the work, but the learning first. And John, you have done the work. In terms of being a teacher and a teacher's teacher, it really is an incredible class, but an incredible amount of work that you put into it, and that's what we put into it on top of that is what we take away. So everybody, the choice is yours. You are here. We're here for 5 days with Mr. John Gringo live. You guys are part of this experience, the live experience. Again, people are participating in the chat rooms. It's been a great day, all the conversations going on, new folks, regulars. After the live event, you can then still get access to the class by purchasing anytime access. Kind of like on demand, you can go back and you can look exactly for what you were looking for. Maybe it was that part about the sensors. You're thinking about what kind of camera do I buy. You want to, what is that he said about the full frame versus the other and the other and the other. It is hard to take in all at once, and that is why we do sell the anytime access, and we try to make that, just like our free classes, as affordable as we can to as many people out there. So $149 for this class of 5 days. When you buy it right now, it is $99 for 5 days. I don't even want to think about what that breaks down to, because that is an incredible value that you guys are getting. We're getting nodding heads, shaking heads in here. But again, there's a green buy button beneath the video that you are seeing right now. That's how you add it to your cart and to your Creative Live library. Anything else for you today, Susan?
And how you add it to your life.
That's true.
I don't know. I guess I just want to say that, when you want to be creative as a photographer and you have all these artsy ideas in your head, and until you have these tools solidly in your toolbox, it is really hard to express yourself the way you want to. So that is why these are the fundamentals, and that is why this is so important. This will take your photography to any level that you want it to be at. You just have to start here.
And we're only getting started.
Everybody,
we'll see you again tomorrow for day 2 of the Fundamentals of Digital Photography with John Gringo. Thank you for joining us and for all of your questions today. Thanks, Susan.
Thanks, Kenna.